Welcome, everyone, to the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast. I am co-host, licensed battlefield guide Eric Lindblade, and as always, I am joined by my co-host, licensed battlefield guide Jim Hessler. So Jim, last week we covered the background and filming of the movie Gettysburg, and also a little bit of background on the book The Killer Angels as well. Yeah. But we sort of felt as we were getting into it that, that was kind of a good point to put a stop there and then transition to what we're doing this week, which is going to be a deep dive into the content of those films. But we do think that the background was really important for you to have. We also think it's something interesting that a lot of listeners may not have had going in.
Yeah, that's right. Like we said, we want to give you a little bit of context, how and why the Killer Angels and the motion picture Gettysburg came together. But tonight on the podcast, now what we're really going to focus on is kind of a rewatch. Now, for various reasons, we're not going to pop in the 4-hour DVD and play it while you guys are listening to us here. So I will tell you that prior to recording this podcast, Eric and I both spent at least 4.5 hours of our own personal time for your benefit rewatching this movie and taking copious notes on some of the various aspects of the film that caught our attention. So, not only is this a free podcast, Eric and I say every episode, we do this at our own time and expense, but we added an additional 4.5 hours of our time this week for you, the listener. So you wouldn't necessarily have to rewatch the movie Gettysburg. We did it for you.
I actually watched it twice.
I actually only got about 3 hours and 45 minutes into it. But, so between the two of us, I think we got it covered.
And as always, we are coming to you from the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast studios inside the world-famous Reliance Mine Saloon here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So we want to thank them for their support of the show throughout this season. And we also want to thank our new sponsor, which is RPM Search Group. Jim, could you tell us a little bit more about our sponsor, RPM Search Group?
Sure. Michael Homula, who is a friend of mine, is also the founder and managing partner of RPM. Michael is an avid student and frequent visitor to Gettysburg. I shared the story on the last episode about the time I found Michael stumbling out of Rose's Woods near the wheat field. Because like most of us, like most of you listening, Michael's on this never-ending journey to kind of learn and know more about the Battle of Gettysburg. And that's kind of the way Michael runs his business. If your company is on a quest for senior and executive level talent, the kind of talent that will move the needle on corporate performance, then you want to visit RPM's webpage at www.rpmsearchgroup.com to learn more about RPM Search Group and how they help companies in the United States and around the world identify, evaluate, and hire talent that drives profit and performance. We want to thank Michael for underwriting some of the costs of our episode. We want to thank Michael for being a devoted listener and a Gettysburg student in his own right. And again, check out RPM's website. That page again is www.rpmsearchgroup.com. Back to you, Eric.
And before we get into the episode, we do want to let you know where you can find us on social media, because this show is really driven by social media and our listeners and their questions. So you can find us on Facebook at the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast. You can also find us on Twitter at Gettysburg Pod, and you can find us on Instagram at the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast. You can also email us at gettysburgpodcast@gmail.com.
Very good. All right, let's get into the rewatch. So obviously, the first thing that comes on screen is you get a big honkin' opening theme and credits. And I think, Eric, when I sort of watch this through the prism of 1993 historical epics, you don't open your movies kind of that way anymore. There's a fist-pumping kind of opening theme music. Maybe it's not everybody's sort of cup of tea, but I like it. Although it starts off big, then it kind of descends into this extended credit. Hell, when you have a 4.5-hour movie, you got a lot of people in the cast that you got to service. Something you don't do much anymore, these long opening credits, but then you kind of get into this opening narration. And, what strikes me in that is the opening narration talks about the main objective is to draw out and destroy the Union Army, which, by the way, they clock in at 80,000 men. I think most of us Gettysburg scholars would kind of add another 10 to 15,000 guys to that total, but destroy the 80,000 man Union Army as it goes into Maryland.
Yes, Maryland.
I always kind of giggle the way the guy who plays Trimble says Maryland, because he is doing the narration, in case anybody didn't know that. And probably my favorite, quote, "A letter has been prepared, a letter that offers peace, will be played on Lincoln's desk the day after the Army of the Potomac is destroyed." Eric, I got to ask you, over the years, I don't think I've ever kind of come across a legitimate primary source that talks about a letter of peace coming north with the Army of Northern Virginia and will be placed on Lincoln's desk. Am I missing anything there?
I don't think you're missing anything, and I should add that when we view the battle through that prism, it forgets a lot of other things that are going on with this war at the same time.
Well, yeah.
As Lee's army's moving into Maryland, there's some guy named Ulysses S. Grant that's laying siege to Vicksburg right now. There's Union operations elsewhere. So the idea, there's a letter there, it's dramatic. I've never seen any account, but on tours, I will tell people, really the three objectives the Confederate Army has. Yep. One, they're trying to win a major decisive victory on northern soil, which this does kind of address. Mm-hmm. The second is they want to take the war out of Virginia. Yep. And the third is they're on a giant foraging expedition.
Right. A raid, if you would like.
A raid, if you will. So those are kind of the three objectives I normally give Lee. Of course, that is not dismissing everything else that's going on.
Right.
Because really, at this point in the war in 1863, I don't think you can argue the Confederacy's winning the war. In fact, they're losing the war. And in many ways, they are basing their best hopes on Lee's army into this invasion of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, that was great. I have a vague recollection that one of the Confederate staff officers' memoirs talk about a letter being drawn up, but right now, off the top of my head, I can't think who and where. I think, too, though, that this kind of perpetuates a romantic notion of the Confederacy, which is prevalent throughout the film, that all we want is to be left alone, and we've prepared a letter that will lead to peace, and we will give it to you after we destroy your army. But again, I think it's sort of just this romantic notion gets perpetuated right off the opening bat that, all the Confederacy really wants is to be left alone. And not really here today to argue the merits of that historically, frankly, because I just don't feel like getting into it because we still got another 4.5-hour movie to watch. But just kind of the idea that it's, it's a little lost cause-y for me.
And I think also this is the point of the episode where if we do have any Western theater listeners, which why do they listen to a Gettysburg podcast? They normally ignore us, but they're probably going, Vicksburg, Atlanta,
that's right.
What about all this? Well, this kind of leads some of that, for lack of a better term, maybe puffing up the importance of Gettysburg a little bit. Yeah. But hey, this is the movie Gettysburg. This is not Vicksburg.
That's right.
So we're talking about Gettysburg today.
Vicksburg, Chickamauga, when you get your own 4.5-hour movie, you can ignore us too.
Not just 4.5-hour movie, 4.5-hour epic
event. Look, a common thing in historical movies is to sort of compress timelines, and we kind of see one right off the bat. Harrison, the scout, the spy, the actor, arrives in the Confederate camp not on June 28th, not on June 29th, but on June 30th, the very eve of battle. Probably one of my least favorite aspects of this film is the portrayal of Harrison, but there's a couple of scenes with him kind of watching two brigades going at something like a gallop, which would be kind of hard to imagine them keeping up that pace. But again, it looks good on the screen. Harrison stumbles into a white-haired picket line, a very well-fed, well-nourished Confederate soldier. Although I do like the emphasis that they kind of give us right off the bat that, you aren't in uniform and you'll be hanged. And I do kind of like that I think gives you some historical integrity around, look, this is how we treated spies. And if you're a spy, you're dead. And I do kind of like that they throw that in.
And we do see accounts from that on both sides of the worry of this and the impact that it would have. So that's, I think, not a stretch in this point. Of course, the first Confederate that you see there, the head of the picket line, not an accurate depiction of what a Confederate soldier would have looked like at that point in the war. But it does make for an interesting opening sequence, puts you into the moment, and here's Harrison, kind of gives you a sense of the danger and everything that's going on there. Yeah, I agree.
And again, I was not at whenever this movie premiered in Washington or whatever, there's always been a story that when they did that opening scene with the picket, that Ed Bars kind of shouted out, I didn't know they had fat Confederates. Again, I wasn't there, but that's a story that I've always heard. But then from there, we kind of go into Longstreet's camp as Harrison Harrison is brought in. And again, I always kind of snicker at this sort of opening scene of Longstreet's camp because it's all there. You got a Reb strumming his banjo. You got a guy looking through a telescope in the middle of camp. Guy's reading the newspaper. Another guy is shaving. It's like sort of every slice of Confederate camp life you could possibly figure out is all happening right outside the lieutenant general's tent. Thank God Longstreet's not trying to sleep with that infernal music going on or something like that.
Yeah, I was taken aback by the sort of very lazy, lackadaisical Confederate camp. Yeah, this is the middle of the day. I like the guy looking up in the telescope.
I know,
What's he
right?
looking at in the middle of the day?
Yeah.
And as if these guys don't have jobs. They don't have an army to run. They're just hanging out by Longstreet's tent. Just, we'll get to the battle later. But I do think the portrayal of Harrison was a real individual. Mm-hmm. There are a number of accounts in the historiography of a spy named Harrison. You'll sometimes also see him listed as Longstreet's spy. Right. Although there is some question as to whether there are multiple other spies. So I think it's kind of a combination of an individual as well as maybe a composite of some other spies and scouts that were operating during this time in the Gettysburg campaign for the Confederacy.
Harrison for many years was misidentified as James Harrison, but today we think he is Henry T. Harrison. Longstreet in Battles and Leaders in his memoirs writes of meeting Harrison during the Suffolk campaign during spring of '63, who supposedly came into camp with a letter of endorsement from the Confederate Secretary of War. And then Longstreet's staff officer Moxley Searle also writes of Harrison. I think sort of the thing in my mind that is overplayed in the movie is obviously the acting thing. Searle relayed a story in his memoirs that in September of '63, after the Battle of Gettysburg, Harrison told him he was going to play some Shakespeare in Richmond. And, Searle kind of asked if he was an actor and was told, no, but I can play. So, in fact, Searle did happen to be in Richmond on the night of this grand performance and found Harrison to be pretty good on stage, but also drunk. So Searle learned that Harrison had been drinking and gambling. Searle reported his concerns back to Longstreet, and they actually decided that Harrison might be a security risk. And they basically later in the month of September paid off Harrison and kind of sent him packing. Now, obviously, they kept in touch with the guy, as Longstreet includes a later image of Harrison in his memoirs. But what I think happens is nobody really identified Harrison's first name. So Harrison, it's kind of a common name. But in a 1970 article, he was misidentified as James Harrison, an actor who appeared regularly in Richmond. And again, I don't know this for sure, but I'm thinking, okay, this comes out in 1970. Scherer writes The Killer Angels in 74, probably thinking, and this is where all of the acting and the Shakespearean stuff and, just kind of gets overblown. But I think that's kind of where it enters the story. The real Harrison actually seemed like kind of a desperate, restless figure. He's going to marry later. He's going to disappear in Montana in the 1860s. He's going to reemerge around 1893, moving to Ohio. And he's kind of just this restless, roaming figure, kind of goes, it seems, from place to place and abandons his family until he dies. Right now appears to be 1923.
A lot of the reason we kind of did a bit of a deep dive into Harrison is it was actually from a listener question. Superfan Neil asked about, what do we know about the Harrison of reality versus the Harrison as he's depicted? So we hope we shed a little bit of light onto that. And of course, as pointed out, there's what we know. There's what we don't know. I think there's a lot in between there. But I think certainly an actor, a Shakespearean actor, if you will, for Scherer would be a very interesting character. Adds just kind of a little bit of nuance to the book. So I think that's why he does kind of play this prominent role early.
Yeah, certainly overplayed. So, in this opening scene then, as you kind of take Harrison to Longstreet's camp, although I think the portrayal of Harrison throughout the movie is pretty campy, I kind of like some of the sass he's showing in this opening. But obviously, we also get to meet Longstreet. I'll go on record now as saying it. I actually think Longstreet, Tom Berenger's performance, is the best in the movie. I'm not dismissing Daniels and Chamberlain. I like Chamberlain, but I actually think Berenger's got the best performance in the movie, taking a guy like Longstreet, who might not have otherwise been a sympathetic character, and making him sympathetic. I think the real challenge is because his beard is so crappy, audiences just distract from what Berenger is doing and what Longstreet is saying and go for the beard. And I think that's a real shame.
So we're urging you to look beyond the beard.
Look beyond the beard.
And look at the character of the performance.
That's a good point, because you think about what was in style in 1993 in the early 2000s versus 2019. I would dare to say that Longstreet's movie beard is actually coming back in style, and you can see these shaggy-haired rebels walking up and down Steinwehr Avenue or any other street in this country basically day and night. So I think maybe it's time that our culture reassessed Longstreet's beard, that it's not quite as bad as we made it out to be in 1993.
If you're going to reassess Longstreet as a historical figure, you must reassess the beard.
I think that's fair. So, okay, but something critical does happen in this conversation that obviously we think has a significant impact on historical interpretation, and that's where we're talking about Stuart. And Harrison says, Stuart's been riding up north somewhere getting his name in the papers, and he hasn't caused nothing but a fuss, or something to that effect. I think that's the exact quote. But, that's important because obviously right off the bat, in a memorable sort of way, it is telling listeners that, hey, Jeb Stuart is just off screwing around and isn't doing anything important. Pretty important on interpretation.
I can't count the number of times I've had someone say, oh, Stuart, now he's off joyriding, right? He's really not here yet. And also, let's look at the time frame. We make kind of a joke about the quote, he's riding up north somewhere, getting his name in the papers. If you had listened to our episode 2 on June 28th, we established a timeline of when this starts to make its way through the papers. So by June 30th, Stuart's ride up through that area would have been covered in northern newspapers. So it's not beyond a rational interpretation that a spy could have read some of that. Of course, if he is a good intelligence gatherer, that's not what he's interpreting to Robert E. Lee or to James Longstreet. And also, I think it really diminishes exactly what Stuart's role was in that part of the campaign.
Yeah, I think so. And getting to this newspaper thing, obviously this continues then when Longstreet goes to meet Lee and talk about Harrison's report. Historically accurate, Lee was skeptical, and he is portrayed as being skeptical in the movie. The famous, an actor? We move on the word of an actor. But Lee in real life was skeptical of receiving this kind of intelligence. But kind of tying back to our June 28th episode, Longstreet has that line, oh, one other thing, like it's an afterthought. Hooker's been replaced. George Meade. Harrison read it in the papers, and again, this kind of ties back to what we said. Certainly by June 30th, that was in the newspapers. And also Lee is thinking, okay, we might have an opportunity here to move swiftly. I think what ultimately in real life surprises Lee and Longstreet is that it's Meade who moves swiftly. But I think this idea that Lee is thinking, okay, we might have an opportunity here, I think is, again, historically accurate.
One of the other important aspects of this scene is when Lee and Longstreet are discussing what is happening, the information from Harrison, and then Lee asks Longstreet to look at the map. And of course, he'll famously say, General, I've left my spectacles over there. What's the name of that town? And Longstreet says, Gettysburg, sir.
Right, and the music dramatically swells.
And now we get this point where they're pointing to Gettysburg. We're sort of starting to have these armies converge. And to me, there's a little bit of fact, there's a little bit of fiction here. I think certainly if you're Robert E. Lee, if you look at the disposition of his army at this point, roughly speaking, he has a portion of his army in the Chambersburg area. He has a portion of his army in the Carlisle area. He also has a portion of his army in the York area. Controlling an area where 10 roads intersect is important. That would be a natural place to concentrate and maneuver your army through. So I think the importance of the road junction isn't understated, but it sort of makes it seem as if they're now setting the stage for the battle to be fought here, which I don't really think by this point they would have been really considering.
What I get when I watch that scene, again, kind of what you said, because he says, we should converge east of here. All the roads lead to this junction, which turns out to be Gettysburg. The thing that I kind of get out of that scene is maybe it's just the way I listen to it, I hear it, but I almost feel like they're just discovering that for the first time. What's the name of that place? It's Gettysburg kind of thing. And I certainly think they would have studied the maps more. Well, they did. I don't have to think. They did study the maps more comprehensively before June 30th. And Lee and Longstreet already knew that the roads led to Gettysburg and already knew that that was an important juncture. So we talked about this in the other episode, as they start to decide to concentrate at Cashtown Yorktown or Gettysburg, June 28th, June 29th, and then into June 30th. Quite certainly. They already knew Gettysburg, and the movie kind of makes it sound like they're just stumbling on that for the first time, and that's the part that's always bothered me a little bit.
And never mind the fact that Jubal Early came through 4 days earlier.
Right. You almost want Behringer to go, Jesus, you remember Early came through 4 days ago? Kind of thing. But maybe in the 5-hour version we'll get that.
And this is, of course, where folks can nitpick the movie and say, look at a terrible job they did. Keep in mind, they're trying to compress the entire, at this point, almost month campaign into one scene.
And dare I say, as Battlefield guides, we sometimes get criticized for, compressing. You get the guy who raises his hand and says, oh, you didn't talk about the Battle of Chancellorsville and all that stuff. Folks, when you're telling any story, Battlefield tour, movie, writing a book or whatever, there's things you got to compress. Now you guys can decide if you think the movie is compressed, the right things or the wrong things, and that's part of the fun of kind of doing a rewatch and going through it.
So the next scene we see is the camp of the 20th Maine. They're going to play a bit of a role in this movie moving forward, in case you've never watched this. Spoiler alert.
Yeah, so we are introduced to Jeff Daniels as Joshua Chamberlain and also Sergeant Buster Kilrain, the only major fictional character in the movie. Speaking of camp, it's a little campy here with his Kilrain lays on the Irish accent thick and calls Chamberlain. I counted at least 3 times during the opening dialogue where he calls him Dallin and then adds a me lad at least once. So it's, it's a little over the top, but Chamberlain is down with the heat. And so what we learn kind of in this opening exchange is that we get a sense that Chamberlain is fairly new to regimental command. I don't think they ever really say in the movie when that turnover happened, but we kind of get a sense he's kind of new.
The closest is later when he's talking to Buckland. He'll say that I took command a couple days ago.
Right, okay, you're right.
You're
right. Maybe I was sleeping in that scene, but you're right. So he does do that. But then obviously we learn there's going to be conflict in the 20th Maine. The hard heads of the 2nd Maine, about 120 men, have mutinied and are going to be given to 20th Maine, and you can shoot them if you want. But that sort of sets the stage now for conflict and some things that are going to kind of show us, what an effective leader Chamberlain is. And so, one of this movie is known for is speeches. And so we start off as the 2nd Maine men arrive. Daniels/Chamberlain gives a fairly lengthy and extended speech on why we all volunteered to fight for the Union. No fighting for loot or a king. We're out to set other men free and other things like that. Kind of the thing I have the hardest time with in the movie. Certainly, Chamberlain did not welcome the 2nd Maine into camp with that kind of pep talk. The whole thing just smacks as a little indulgent, unrealistic, but again, you've got to introduce the audience to what kind of man of integrity Chamberlain is, and that's kind of, what we get. Another speech, one of many that are going to come throughout the course of the movie.
And even though the speech is overdrawn, to me, it does introduce at least the Union perspective of this. Why are these soldiers fighting? Of course, it's a very simplified take on the reasons that Union soldiers would have had. Certainly, there were men that were fighting to end the institution of slavery. Certainly, there were men that were fighting to preserve the Union. There were also men that were fighting for loot. You had a number of men that enlisted in the army because there's a bounty. So there is that. But I think it also introduces Chamberlain as a very educated, well-spoken individual, which historically he was. So this does kind of give that background to who he is as a person, which I think is important.
Yeah, I think as a professor of rhetoric, this kind of introduces him to the audience. The only other thing I'll mention, Eric, because I have been asked about this on tours before, is the whole thing with the 2nd Maine historically accurate. And a bunch of hardheads from the 2nd Maine were integrated into the camp of the 20th Maine, but it didn't occur one day before the battle. It occurred, if I remember correctly, over an extended period in May and June. They didn't all come in at once, but the essence is basically there. Chamberlain had to work these guys into the regiment. He separated them and things to that effect, and ultimately did effectively add to the fighting force of the 20th Maine. It just didn't all happen on June 30th like it does in the movie.
And this also speaks to the reorganization that's going to be taking place in the Army of the Potomac. And after Chancellorsville, you have a lot of units that are leaving that army. 9-month units, 2-year units. You see some of those leaving. I think the 2nd Maine is one of those caught into that. And we will see sort of the Confederate version of this a little bit later, involving another Chamberlain.
All right, so it's a full 32 minutes into the movie before we see our first appearance from Sam Elliott as John Buford. I touched on this a little bit in the last episode, but I'm going to go into a little bit more now. You know, in 2019, 26 years later, I would argue that at this time, I think Elliott as Buford is kind of eclipsed Daniels and Chamberlain as the most popular performance in the movie. Now, granted, some of that became because of the inevitable Chamberlain backlash, which I am not a fan of, and I want to make sure we talk about today. You know, when I get tours and I say, hey, you want to see the 20th Maine and Chamberlain, I get a lot of blank looks, but if I say Buford and I hold up a picture of Sam Elliott as Buford, I still get a fair amount of recognition. And I think, you know, 25 years on, it's really Elliott as Buford that people remember. But anyways, so it's about 32 minutes into the movie, and, you know, we see infantry moving alone without cavalry. Strange, very strange. As Buford and his staff officers are kind of watching all of this. And again, I just say, okay, what the hell day is it at this point in the movie? Because we saw Harrison come in on June 30th. We seem to have seen Lee and Longstreet go to bed and start another day. And then here we are outside of Gettysburg with Buford watching enemy soldiers come in. And I'm watching this thinking, well, geez, I guess this must be the morning of July 1st. And it's not. It's still June 30th. So I think the movie's got a serious editing problem here and kind of jumbling some of this that, you know, the viewer really doesn't have a clear sense of what day it is and whether or not, you know, we're on July 1st.
And I will admit, before I did the rewatch of this is the first time that I've watched the movie Gettysburg since I've been a Battlefield Guide.
Is that right?
So it was years since the last time I watched, and I noticed that too, that sort of the timing seemed a little off. We'll get into that even as it relates to the events of the first day. But what this scene is depicting is the North Carolina Brigade of Johnston Pettigrew advancing down the Chambersburg Pike on June 30th. But this is kind of an important scene, and also the way it's depicted, to me, is not factually accurate. A lot of the accounts we have from Pettigrew's brigade actually have them in the vicinity of Seminary Ridge by the time that they cite Buford's men. So the idea that they're just wandering down the road is not factually accurate, in my opinion, the way it's played out. But it does introduce Buford as the eyes and ears of an army, as this intelligence gatherer, and sort of this tough, battle-hardened soldier.
Well, I think you're right. The point that you bring up about it not really being accurate, I think ties to a general problem this movie has with the first day, some of which is alleviated in the director's cut. Now, we touched on this in our last episode. We both did our rewatch based on the 2011 director's cut, which does have some extended scenes. So you kind of get a bonus scene here where Buford and some of his guys are riding through a cemetery, which again is clearly supposed to be Evergreen Cemetery. I've seen some local people snicker that it doesn't look like it. Come on, man. Cut them some slack. It's clearly supposed to be Evergreen Cemetery. But during this sort of scene, Buford is explaining that Lee has turned the army and headed this way. And I think there's some pretty useful exposition about the intelligence that Buford is gathering. If you don't watch this bonus scene, I kind of think you miss all that. And to your point, Eric, it just looks like rebels are marching down the road for no reason. And it's one of the reasons why I really do prefer the director's cut. Now, again, Buford does ride through in the extended scene, really the only representation the movie has of the town of Gettysburg. And there are some absolutely awful performances by some people portraying, I guess would be the right word, some of the civilians in the town. There's kind of a fat mayor worried about his chickens, hogs, and horses. And Buford kind of deals with this clown with a smirk, you know, that something about dignitaries troubles me. They talk too much and they're never worried to ask a man to die for them, which again is a good insight into Buford's character, or at least the character of Buford we're getting in the movie.
And also I think the civilian portrayal, at one point they look at the famous broadside of, the enemy is approaching, defend the Commonwealth. And they go, oh my God, I can't believe they made it this far north. Well, 4 days before, Jubal Early's guys marched right through the town. They would have known that. They would have also had refugees from Hagerstown and Chambersburg coming over the mountain, letting them know what's going on. So it kind of sets the civilians up as almost being these sort of country bumpkins that have no idea what's going on, which is not accurate. It
Right.
just not true.
Yeah, agree. So, one of the things we wanted to have fun with was some of our favorite lines of dialogue, right? We've already seen a few classic quotes from Harrison, but this is now kind of where Sam Elliott really goes off on a scene-chewing rant as Buford that just goes... It just goes on and on and on. The whole damn Reb army. Lee will have the high ground. There'll be the devil to pay. The high ground. And it just goes on and on. He's talking about the wire will be hot with messages. Attack, attack. And, again, just clearly emphasizing the high ground. I think he says high ground like 20 times during this 90-second rant. Again, whether you think it's a good performance, a bad performance, I'm sort of in the middle on it. It's kind of a classic scene in the movie. It's funnier than hell, as you just kind of choose the scenery for several minutes. But obviously, too, it sets the stage, Eric, that the battle is all about the high ground. Not the high ground at South Mountain, not the high ground that exists anywhere else in Pennsylvania, but we're starting to set the stage here that the significance of Gettysburg isn't the roads or anything else. It's the high ground. And Buford chews the hell out of his scenery telling us that.
And I think the scene also speaks to a little bit about the feelings of futility that maybe many in the Army of the Potomac would have felt at this point, that here we are 2 years into this thing. We don't really have a win yet. We're getting frustrated. So I think it speaks to that. Historically, a lot of people have gone back and forth on what did Buford really identify in terms of the high ground.
Yeah.
To me, I think he's looking mostly at the road network. He knows where these pieces are together. I have to think if we do have to fight a battle here, this is not a bad place to do it, but I don't think he sees this as being, this is where the battle will be fought. Mm-hmm. And I think it sort of sets that into play, that it's John Buford that decides, hey, the Battle of Gettysburg is going to be fought at Gettysburg.
Yeah. And then so we kind of moved to an evening scene, a nice scene sort of shot outside the Lutheran Seminary here in Gettysburg, where Buford is kind of summarizing his intelligence in a message to Reynolds. So I watched this scene and go, oh, okay, we are still on June 30th. We haven't moved to July 1st yet. Talks about Confederates being west, Ewell coming in from Carlisle, and all that other stuff. I've seen some historians nitpick this over the years, fine, but it's more or less a replay of Buford's actual message from the night of June 30th. So I don't really have any problems with that part.
That's factually accurate for the most part. I mean, Confederates are coming from the west and they're coming from the north. Yep. So it does kind of set up the very least this desperate stand that they're going to have to make the next day, which is going to be a key part of the movie.
Right. Agree. So now we're about 45 minutes into the movie, and we've just gotten to July 1st, the opening of the battle. So again, before we start fighting, we do have a scene with Lee and Walter Taylor kind of, again, talking about it. Lee starts opening by praying, which, I'm okay with, but when I was doing the rewatch, I was kind of struck that I bet you in 2019 that would be left on the cutting room floor. But obviously it tells us the importance of prayer and religion to Robert E. Lee. Now, again, we have a conversation with Lee and Walter Taylor. Once again, there's an extended scene in the director's cut that I'm watching this saying, why was this cut? Because they have a pretty useful conversation about, where is Stewart and why is Hill going to Gettysburg? Now, granted, they say he's going for shoes. And as any good Gettysburg scholar knows, the battle was not fought over shoes. So some of you may be thinking, hey, I'm glad that scene was cut because heaven forbid we perpetuate this shoe thing any longer. But, Lee goes on in this conversation to emphasize, there should be no fighting until we concentrate, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I'm watching it going, this shouldn't have been cut because it gives some context to why we're actually fighting at Gettysburg on July 1st. And instead, the basic scene just goes into Taylor babbling about flapjacks and apple butter and, nonsense like that.
Well, that's why I moved to Pennsylvania.
For the apple butter or the flapjacks?
Both.
Oh, well, can't play. Shoes? Do you need shoes?
Well, I did. The shoe thing, though, I think is interesting because if we look back to when Michael Shara would have been putting together the research for the novel The Killer Angels, you still see this shoe thing showing up in a lot of the narratives in the Battle of Gettysburg. Yeah. So he's not going to do a historiography dive on shoes. He's a novelist. But it's there, and I think it's sort of lingered into the movie. Because, of course, it's written almost word for word in some respects from the book.
There's also some good exposition, too, about Lee's feelings with respect to civilians. And again, as Lee takes a little bit of a beating over the course of the next 4 hours in this movie, I think it's good to remember that they actually do slide these little pro-Lee movements in at times. But then Longstreet rides up for a conference, and once again, the Confederates strike up the band. I mean, did these guys always play music every time Longstreet showed up? I mean, you studied the Army in Northern Virginia. What's up with that?
You know what? I've spent a lot of time researching the band of the 26th North Carolina and other Confederate bands, but I don't think that music plays every time a Confederate general shows up.
So you think that?
I don't think that's historically accurate.
You think that might be a little bit of a dramatic license?
Just a bit. Now, Lee will make a comment about the importance of bands to morale.
Sure,
and
many
Army
generals
life.
did, yeah.
So I wonder if that's kind of a homage to that. But believe me, every time a Confederate general show up, it's not like they have pro wrestling entrance themes.
Right.
Which this kind of reminds us, like Longstreet's got his intro music as he rides up here.
Right, exactly. Okay, all right. Hey, I was just checking on that. I thought maybe you knew something about music that I didn't, so just checking on that. Then we sort of go into some strategy talk between Lee and Longstreet, the idea that Meade's probably going to be making a forced march and we should concentrate, hit him, knock out a few corps hard and quickly. But then, boom, ominously, we hear some distant rumbling on the horizon as Heath goes into action. And, probably rightly so, Lee says, hey, what is that? I ordered no fighting. And now the staff officers and folks are going to kind of get into action to kind of figure out what is all this combat that we're hearing on the horizon.
So now we're getting in, say, to the first shots of the movie Battle of Gettysburg, which of any of the depictions of battle here, this might be the worst.
Oh, yeah.
And I know people say, oh my gosh, this is a very emotional scene. It gets the blood pumping. But it's not historically accurate, folks. It just does not play out really how this will work out on July 1st. All I have to tell you, drive out to the first shot marker on Knoxland Ridge. It's almost 2 miles from McPherson's Ridge. There's a falling back. There is a sort of tenor to this fight that the movie doesn't really capture.
Yeah, that last point is the one I was going to pick on. There's a tenor to the fight that the movie doesn't really capture. It's the book kind of perpetuating this idea that Buford fights a Little Bighorn Alamo last stand and that he's going to lose every man in his command if help doesn't come up. Again, it's very dramatic, but it's historically inaccurate. And you're right, we're about an hour into the movie when we see our first action. A couple summers ago, I watched this with my nephew who, more or less is a millennial, and his comment was, this is a little slow, so we're about an hour into this, where today you could never wait that long to get the first shots fired. But again, back to the tenor of it, artillery on both sides is already deployed. Buford's men are dug in behind fences. It's just not a very accurate portrayal of Buford's delaying action, falling back from ridge to ridge, waiting for Reynolds to come up. What we get instead is, like I said, these dismounted guys kind of dug in behind walls and fences and things like that, getting shot down where they stand. Probably more casualties in the first, 2 minutes of this action in the movie than Buford actually suffered in real life.
If I think of it off the top of my head, I might have to double check that, but I believe it's a minuscule amount, but I think maybe somewhere around like 150, 200 guys.
Yeah, it's low. And obviously, again, the movie basically, doesn't portray that. We get the Cashtown Inn. Got to call a shout out to our friend Pat Fulci, as some very well-dressed Confederates who are very well-dressed in every particular, except they don't have shoes, kind of march by the Cashtown Inn, but we have Pat Fulci at a distance as A.P. Hill, kind of, having some sort of conversation with Lee. So again, the idea that the Army and Lee are coming this way. We just need a little more time.
And I do think the depiction of well-dressed Confederates with no shoes, it is actually somewhat historically accurate. A number of these units in A.P. Hill's Corps are going to be reprovisioned in Richmond before this. A number of North Carolina units certainly were. Of course, marching the amount they do, it wears the shoes off anybody. Folks, it's not just barefoot Confederates in the Gettysburg campaign. If you read accounts in the 11th Corps, other Union commands, they're having issues with footwear. You march that long, it's going to wear the shoes right off your feet. So that is, I think, somewhat actually accurate of a depiction. And one of the main issues I have in the movie at times is how clean these guys look.
Yeah, right.
You look at Chamberlain, he's got a clean white shirt on. There's no dust on these uniforms. These guys have been campaigning for weeks. They're going to be dirty. They're going to be filthy.
And that was really my point with these guys. The uniforms are clean, except their dirty, ragged feet. There's always been a story that Buford, or Sam Elliott in particular, would sort of slap dirt on his uniform to kind of get that Buford look going. But again, a lot of these other guys are in perfect gray, perfect blue, or that sort of thing. And you kind of can't help but laugh at that. So then we get back to the fighting. It's starting to pick up. Buford is clearly hard pressed. Tell Devon all reserves forward now. We're putting in all the reserves, and that then takes Buford to the cupola at the seminary, which is, frankly, a seminal, no pun intended, but a seminal moment. The first day at Gettysburg, the arrival of Reynolds, and did this meeting with Buford happen or not happen? Kind of the way they've portrayed it popularly in the book and the movie.
As they show Reynolds approaching Gettysburg, you will see a barn in the background. For our Gettysburg buffs out there, it is the Trossel barn. Now, Jim, we have not yet done a Dan Sickles update, but can we think about any Sickles connection to the Trossel barn?
We sure can, because, of course, although not portrayed in the film, this edition of the Dan Sickles report will point out that the Trossel farm was the headquarters of General Dan Sickles during the real, non-cinematic Battle of Gettysburg. And when Sickles was wounded tragically by a errant Confederate artillery projectile on the evening of July 2nd, he was struck near the barn. And if you go to the barn today at Gettysburg National Military Park, you can find the memorial that commemorates where Sickles was wounded, as well as his headquarters under a tree in front of the house, in front of the barn. And I think, Eric, that is the at least first segment of today's Dan Sickles report. We might have one or two coming up later.
And I thought it was interesting how they made the shot, because you do have the wounding marker there at the angle they're looking at. So they had to kind of make that shot so the ridge just kind of covers that up. But something I noticed when I did the rewatch. So, of course, we got to work in Dan Sickles into every episode.
Mm-hmm. And we will. I swear that we will.
But enough about Dan Sickles for now. Let's go to his wing commander, John Reynolds.
There you go. So I think one of the things the movie does well, the way the music kind of swells up and you see Aaron Jerome and Buford in the cupola of the seminary, a fake seminary, by the way. They did not film this in the actual cupola here at Gettysburg, but they reconstructed one outside of town, and it's pretty convincing by my view. But anyways, I think one of the things that the movie does well is sort of the drama of Reynolds arriving. The music cues up, you see the flags of the First Corps as Reynolds and a couple of staff officers are riding down the road, and Buford kind of wipes the sweat from his brow and says, "Thank God," and things like that. And, whether it's accurate or not, I think they do a good job dramatically doing that and kind of showing us how important Reynolds is. But there's been a lot of controversy over the years. Did the subsequent meeting where Reynolds rides up underneath the cupola and asks Buford, how goes? And Buford says, "The devil to pay. Can you hold? I reckon I can." Many people have debated over the years whether or not that is an accurate scene. And frankly, that's something that's still debated. If I'm not mistaken, the account of that primarily comes from Jerome, Aaron Jerome, the signal officer, who was in the cupola with, or said he was in the cupola with Buford when that meeting happened. And it's more or less word for word how Jerome said it happened. The devil's to pay, and I reckon I can, basically come to us from Jerome's account. Now, if you've ever stood in the real cupola here at Gettysburg, though, I would point out, it's a little difficult to stand up there and see somebody ride up to the building the way they do in the movie. So Reynolds might have been a little bit further away. There might have been a little more shouting involved than the way we see it portrayed on screen. But again, it's controversial. Some folks tend to think it did happen that way.
So we now see Henry Heath and Robert E. Lee discussing what has happened. And to me, this is where the timeline of the movie as it relates to July 1st really starts going off the rails here. Because it almost has Lee on the battlefield at this moment, which we know Lee will not be there until the afternoon of July 1st. Also, the way that it's going to depict Reynolds famously saying, "Now, let's go surprise Harry Heath." My biggest question is, how do they know it's Harry Heath's division? Now, they know that most likely it's A.P. Hill out there, but how would they know that it's Henry Heath's division leading the march that day? I think that's a little bit of a stretch for me.
Okay, I mean, I think the biggest stretch for me is, what the hell kind of accent is Harry Heath talking in this movie? Sir, very strange, very confused. Is that North Carolina, Eric? I don't know.
That's not North Carolina.
I don't know what
Heath
is that.
was a Virginian.
Yeah,
so.
is it right? Is it one of the Virginian counties? What is this? My boys, they got the dander up. But this idea that Heath really comes off like a bumbling buffoon in this scene. And of course, Lee reprimands Heath for letting things get out of control. But what you now see over the next couple of minutes is Heath, various staff officers, and there's a whole bunch of couriers. What you kind of see is the afternoon of July 1st just getting compressed into a bunch of couriers coming up to Lee and saying, they're running, they're all running, kind of thing. When, last time we saw him, Reynolds was just coming onto the scene. You're right, it's a little confusing at this point, but eventually with some urging from the other guys, Lee kind of mumbles, God's will, and then, my orders to all my commanders, attack! And, Sheen kind of lifts himself up in the stirrups a little bit, kind of see the action picking up. But you're right, the timing is disjointed. Are we in the afternoon? Are we in the morning? We must still be in the morning because we're about to kill Reynolds in the next scene. And the one thing I'll say, Eric, if you come into Gettysburg from the book, the movie, you almost always say, I'm really not a first day guy. And I think it's just because they do such a horrible job portraying it here, other than sort of the Buford Reynolds stuff, some of which I kind of like. The combat is just kind of all over the place.
And even the depiction of Henry Heath, to me, I think they're very unkind to Heath.
Yeah.
And you'll also have people say, oh, he's the guy that just stumbles into this. Well,
right.
The record doesn't really support that.
Right.
But I think this is another aspect where the movie has influenced the way we view some of these commanders. More so Richard Ewell a little bit later.
Yeah.
But I think it does not portray the Confederate commanders on July 1st in a very favorable light.
Yeah, totally agree. And so then we cut back to Reynolds leading the Black Hats of the Iron Brigade into action, and one guy stumbles over a log, another guy kind of flinches before the artillery charge goes off underneath them. So they don't look very Iron Brigade-ish to me, but, hey, at least we get into the movie. And then, of course, a sniper kills Reynolds, and he falls rather stiffly off his horse, where his staff is consoled by the men of the 14th Brooklyn, who learn that he's dead. And, of course, as any good Gettysburg enthusiast knows, they would not have been the guys in that immediate vicinity when Reynolds fell dead. But before we go there, I should just kind of rewind to, again, there were some extended scenes in the director's cut with Reynolds giving orders. Again, the acting is kind of a mixed bag here, but I thought it did kind of a nice job of kind of showing Reynolds as an authority figure. Guy is taking charge, and I think they would have been better served leaving those scenes in the movie, and you would actually feel more for the guy when he's dead, because in the non-extended version, he just shows up and he's dead, and you're like, well, okay, that was no big deal.
And the death of Reynolds, people often say, hey, now when does he get shot by the sniper?
Yeah.
They often say sniper. The term at the time was really more sharpshooter.
Right.
But that's certainly an indelible scene in many people's minds. And I think the way it's played out is there are a number of Confederate accounts that do suggest that individuals will say, hey, I was the guy that shot Reynolds. Mm-hmm. Each one of them have their own major problems, the own reasons why they're not going to work out. There's even one account from a Confederate soldier in the railroad cut that says, I shot Reynolds. Most historians, I believe most guides, I think Jim and I would agree, Reynolds is really in the wrong place, wrong time.
Yeah.
It's an overshoot. It goes over the heads of the men of the Iron Brigade. He's on horseback. It's a bad situation for John Reynolds.
Agree. And we'll touch on more of this. Eric and I have talked about doing a Reynolds episode. Whether or not Reynolds should be in that position or not is something we'll talk about at a later date. But again, as we're talking about the impact this has on interpretation, like you said, we very often get people thinking, okay, did a sharpshooter kill Reynolds? And certainly this does not help do anything but perpetuate that myth.
And to me, the way they show, you mentioned earlier, the 14th Brooklyn around him, a very colorful unit in terms of how they're attired. The scene they create is very akin to these famous paintings you would see of, say, the death of Nelson, the death of General Wolfe. It's this very European-like view where you have these men in colorful uniforms surrounded by the stricken commander in their final moments. In no way is that what it would have looked like. Because we have to think, when Reynolds is killed, the Iron Brigade is engaging Archer's men. They don't have time just to kind of sit around in this quiet little area.
Right.
You would have had a lot of chaos, confusion, and I question whether or not many of the men even around Reynolds would have necessarily even noticed he was killed.
So after a scene of the 20th Maine marching, and hurrah, we find out all the hardheads of the 2nd Maine have decided to join the regiment. It's back to Lee in Longstreet. And as I alluded to before, you see a lot of compression of first day running. Just a bunch of couriers keep running back and forth to Lee. They're running kind of stuff. But this sort of gets into the whole take that hill if practical. So what Lee says in the movie is, I want fire placed on that hill. Take that hill if practical. And by the way, no caveat about avoiding a general engagement. Lee then says to one of the staff officers, do you understand what I mean? He says yes, and off they ride. Longstreet at this point arrives and starts preaching a defensive campaign. Lee tells him, no, the situation has changed. Longstreet challenges Lee and says, they'll be entrenched on the high ground. There's that term again. We're not talking specific hills, but the high ground, and that we should fight on ground of our own choosing. I would say this is really Lee or Sheen's first bad moment in the movie. He's probably trying to look a little off his game, but his voice is too high, his hat is too small, he looks like he's struggling on his horse, and it's just not a good moment for cinematic Robert E. Lee. How can I ask them to retreat? And then finally says, if Meade is there tomorrow, no sir, I will attack. And it just doesn't play well. Although again, Longstreet comes off looking pretty good in this scene like he does in most of the movie, besides the beard. That's the movie version of it. What happens in real life? Because this is an important moment at Gettysburg.
Yeah, I think in real life, some of these issues that are addressed, a lot of it you see in Robert E. Lee's reports on the battle as to why he talks about not moving to another location, not disengaging, why he continues the fight the next day. They just do a very poor job of interpreting that and carrying that forward to the viewers. We do have, by all accounts, some debate between Lee and Longstreet on July 1st.
Yeah, mostly by Longstreet's accounts. Longstreet is the primary guy who writes about this, which again, we know is source material for the Killer Angels.
And I think if we look at this, we look at what Longstreet says, and then we look at what Lee has in his reports. When Lee talks about this sort of evening of July 1st into July 2nd, he talks about the reasons why we don't move away from Gettysburg. Lee is addressing, I think, Longstreet's complaints, which I feel lends a lot of credence to what Longstreet's accounts say. It's at least the case he was putting forward that afternoon. To what extent is that accurately depicted in the movie? That's a little hard to say.
Yeah. So again, what it does now for the movie's point of view, it kind of sets the stage that Lee and Longstreet are going to be butting heads. So then again, we cut from there to more 20th Maine stuff, and doggone it, somebody is playing the fiddle in camp again. This is the two most musical armies I've ever seen on screen. Nothing of real importance in the next section. Part of this is we want to do some of our favorite lines. Of course, Tom Chamberlain meets a guy from Archer's Brigade, which was caught in the railroad cut. We know that's not accurate. Why are you fighting this war? To free the slaves, of course. And then, of course, the guy from Archer's Brigade memorably says, I'm fighting for my rats. Your what? My rats, kind of thing. So another classic moment. But then we get another speech. As superfan Jody from Westminster, Maryland said, at some point I just start fast forwarding through all of the speeches. We get a very long speech. They meet a John Henry, a runaway slave. Buster, talks about, Colonel, my darling, you're a lovely man. We've got to win this war. Interesting, and we're not going to go into it here in the interest of time, but if you want to compare the movie speech versus the speech in the novel, the movie version has been cleaned up a little bit and is certainly more PC than how it originally turned up in the book.
And what strikes me about these scenes is you have the soldier, and I'm using air quotes right now, Archer's Brigade, giving the rebuttal to what Chamberlain had said earlier as to why the Union soldier is fighting the battle. Of course, to me, it really comes across as almost right out of the Lost Cause playbook right there. I mean, it's almost word for word. He does talk about sort of hints at states' rights and issues like this, or our fighting for our rats. What's interesting is what's left out, which they then show in the next scene as they discover a runaway slave. slave, which certainly influenced a lot of the thinking of Confederate leadership as well as Confederate citizens during this time, their views on the institution of slavery. Of course, that's not the topic of this episode, but to me, it kind of is an interesting dichotomy between the two scenes there.
Good. Okay. Now we've finally arrived at the evening of July 1st. We get the first of what feels like several Confederate campfire scenes in this movie. Pickett arrives on the scene. Again, the evening of July 1st? That's a little historically challenging. Pickett and his brigade commanders not only come in and we get to meet all of them, Garnett, Armistead, and Kemper, but also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, our first view of British military observer Arthur Fremantle. So they're all going to kind of sit around the campfire. We get, kind of the most lost cause friendly poker game in history. Again, great lines by Jimmy Kemper. He goes on a rant about Virginia being home and not allowed to be ruled by some president. Virginia, by God, is going to be run by Virginians. And, accurate, but a little less PC. Kemper's one of my favorite characters in the movie because just like Buford, he goes on a couple of epic rants. We get a bonus scene in the director's cut, Kemper and Garnett talking about Longstreet's dead children, which again is an interesting movie cut because that's a big deal in the book. I mean, a lot of that, his grief over his dead children, other than here, that's basically cut from the entire movie. And you also get an extended scene where Pickett complains about not seeing action. He actually mentions, I've lost Corrs and Jenkins brigades, which I think is awesome, and he complains about being last in the march. It's a great scene. It's historically accurate Pickett. I think it's probably historically accurate Longstreet, and again, with some of the other nonsense that made the cut in this movie, I can't imagine why those scenes were originally cut and left for the director's version, because I think they're pretty good stuff. The Lost Cause stuff goes on. Pickett chimes in about a gentleman's club, where other members intrude and we have the right to resign. And I guess a gentleman's club means something totally different in the Confederacy. There's a great moment, too, where I think for the only time in the movie, Armistead actually has a Southern accent. And he says, the British gonna come in on our side. And again, you get another great, often quoted line from Jimmy Kemper. They gonna come in like some damn banker gonna loan us money when we no longer in debt. I don't know whoever was writing Jimmy Kemper's dialogue. I assume it was Ron Maxwell, but man, he hits a couple of home runs just in this one poker game alone.
So our next scene is the Lydia Leicester Farm, Union Army headquarters, on the evening of July 1st. Jim, do you have a couple thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's an interesting scene. Despite the darkness, we have a signal officer waving his flag in front of the Leicester headquarters. But this is an important scene because we meet Commander of the Army of the Potomac, Winfield Scott Hancock. Whoa, wait a minute. He's not actually the commander of the Army of the Potomac, but you kind of wouldn't know that if you haven't watched this movie. By the evening of July 1st, according to the movie, he has apparently chosen the Leicester House. I always thought that was Meade's headquarters. Apparently it's Hancock's headquarters. And Hancock is taking it upon himself to, smoke some cigars, but also meet with all the Corps commanders. We as the viewer don't get to meet any of them, but there's a room full of guys, or I don't know, something to that effect. A couple interesting lines of dialogue. We're going to send Reynolds' body to his folks in Lancaster. Talks about how they came up together. Me, Reynolds, and Low Armistead. So I guess we're just going to forget Henry Heath, maybe because of the bad accent. And I like Hancock in the movie. I think he comes off very likable, probably more likable than the real Hancock, in my opinion. But Hancock here says A at least twice, like, good job today, eh? Kind of thing. So I don't know, is he turning Canadian in this movie? I'm not clear what kind of accent movie Hancock is kind of working with here.
I do want to point out, as I look carefully, there is a 3rd Corps headquarters flag on display. Jim, refresh my memory. Who was in command of the Union 3rd Corps on the evening of July 1st?
Well, Eric, I think that would be none other than Dan Sickles, who is, of course, missing from this film. Or is he? Because there's then a subsequent scene after a brief cut to Lee's headquarters. We come back to Hancock's staff meeting. Some angry guy named General Meade storms in. Yeah, it's so damn dark out there. Really kind of comes in as kind of a downer. You know, everybody at that point's having a good time, smoking cigars, and this downer, General Meade, kind of storms in. They almost talk about the good ground pornographically. You know, General Hancock, is this good ground? Very good ground. While they're doing that, the camera kind of pans to a bunch of officers in the room, and I can't prove it because I was not on set in 1992, but I swear to God, there is one guy with brown hair and a mustache smoking a cigar, and I can't help but wonder, is that supposed to be, to date, the only cinematic portrayal of Dan Sickles? If anybody who was on set is listening, you know, kind of write in and tell us. I think, Eric, we have a Dan Sickles sighting in the movie. I just can't prove it.
We also have an Oliver Howard sighting.
Oh, is he there too?
As you walk in, there's a scene of a one-armed Union officer there. Of course, that is Oliver Howard. I want to get back to what you said earlier, though, about Reynolds' death. And Hancock says, you know, I ordered the body back to his folks in Lancaster. I did some research on that. Reynolds' parents were both dead.
Yeah, I know.
Now, where I'm from, when you say folks, you mean parents.
Yeah.
Also, Hancock's there. We have this meeting taking place in the Leicester House.
Mm-hmm.
It happens on Cemetery Hill.
Yeah.
And actually, at this point, it's not Winfield Scott Hancock in command of the Union Army on the battlefield at that point. It's Henry Slocum of the 12th Corps until Meade arrives.
Good point.
So we got a lot of things kind of jumbled about here.
But do we really want to introduce Slocum? Was Slocum friends with Armstead? You know, it just sort of...
Here we are, we're being historians. You know what? We're being too stuffy, boring
That's
historians.
right. Should we just pop the popcorn and enjoy the movie for what it is? Should we do that? Where the hell is Slocum? So again, it's kind of an odd scene, but hey, if you're a General Meade fan, you get your only General Meade sighting of the entire 4.5-hour movie.
Yeah, he just played a minor role in the battle, just being commander of the Army of the Potomac.
Yeah.
Nothing major there.
Yeah, I guess he doesn't like the dark, apparently.
No, he doesn't.
It's so dark out there. All right, now we go to one of the most memorable scenes in the movie. Folks, we're still not done with July 1st yet, because it's back to Lee's headquarters, and Lee is confronted by an angry General Isaac Trimble. When I knew less about the battle and I was watching my DVD in 1995 and 1996, it's not always clear in the opening of the rant who Trimble is talking about, because he kind of just says, I stood there, his bald head kind of thing. I mean, it's only with a little knowledge you kind of realize this is Ewell that he's bagging on. But again, a memorable moment, one of, I think, our mutual favorites. I throw down my sword, down on the ground. Trimble, wants another assignment, and Ewell is a bloody disgrace, and that sort of thing. Again, totally one-sided. All we get is a very memorable performance that says Ewell screwed up, with one exception, which we'll come to in a few minutes. We're really not going to get Ewell's side of it. And again, this is, I think, damaging to the historical image of Richard Ewell.
As we talked about in our most popular episode, What If Jackson Was at Gettysburg, Richard Ewell on July 1st, this is the image people have of Richard Ewell, for better or worse. Forget what's been written, forget about the great works that have been done. This is what people think. Ewell screwed up. Now, I will say that this is an accurate portrayal of Isaac Trimble. Because if you read Trimble's writings, he was always right.
Yeah,
he
right.
He always knew every right decision everybody should make. The funny thing is, he writes this later, but man, he doesn't ever seem to express that in the moment.
Right,
funny
exactly.
that Isaac Trimble.
Yeah, funny that happens, right? And the thing that makes me laugh about the rant, too, is repeatedly says, sir, I request another assignment. What the hell is your assignment? You're coming up here without an assignment. So, you've got movie Trimble kind of saying, hey, give me something else. You don't have anything right now other than hanging out with Ewell.
Frankly, Richard Ewell probably would have welcomed that. I think by this point, Ewell's pretty much had it with Isaac Trimble.
Yeah. And I think after this one scene, I might have had it with Isaac Trimble already too, but he'll be back to haunt us later on in the movie. Now, there's a bonus scene, though. And again, director's cut. I wish they would have kept this in. We then have a scene where Ewell actually makes an appearance in the movie, along with Early, Rhodes, and Hill. And Lee is basically dressing them down for not taking that hill. Again, I think the portrayal of Jubal Early, especially in this scene, is a little too soft-spoken. And Ewell kind of comes off as, General Lee. I think I was too slow today. I think overall, though, it's kind of a good scene. And I think, again, badly needed to give some context to Richard Ewell. But we don't get it. We don't get it in the basic version. Our friend Pat Fulci actually gets to speak as A.P. Hill. Would love to talk to Mr. Maxwell sometime and know why some of these cuts were originally made.
So mercifully, we've just gotten through July 1st.
We almost kind of did this in real time. I mean, it took a little bit longer than we were thinking, but we're having fun. Hopefully somebody listening is having fun. If you're not having fun, remember this was free.
And also, we're trying to give you some context that is important to this, too, because one of our points at the end is going to be the influence this has had on the interpretation of the battle and people's thoughts. So we're trying to put a little more meat to the bone, if you will, of this episode. So we're now moving into July 2nd. Really, in the movie, a lot of great scenes in the day. Of course, this is going to be the high point of the 20th Maine moving forward into the film.
All right, so the morning of July 2nd opens with a very detailed conference, really between several officers of the Confederate High Command. Again, not quite the way it happened in real life. Walter Taylor particularly has a very detailed fishhook map talking about, the Federals occupy a fishhook position.
Was that a Hotchkiss map that you got yelled at a round table for?
It could have been.
Was that the one?
It could have been. I know a lot of guys who love their maps. Taylor's got a very detailed one, which of course the Confederate High Command did not have at that point on the morning of July 2nd. They had a map. They just didn't know that the Union Army was in a fishhook, the way it's described here. Although it's interesting, although they don't get into the whole thing about Johnston's reconnaissance and all of that, what is interesting is even at this point in the film, what they do tell us with the fishhook is that the round tops are not occupied, which I think was sort of interesting. And again, kind of the idea that, okay, later on we're going to attack over these hills because they're not occupied, but just kind of an interesting thing. There's kind of some odd stuff. I mean, think they get the basics right. Longstreet will attack. Ewell will demonstrate. Hill will support. Hill will support with Heath in reserve, which I always thought was kind of a weird line. Like, is Heath no longer with Hill? I just kind of thought that was weird that they sort of separated Heath like that. Maybe people were wondering what happened to the actor. I don't know.
And also part of Heath's division is still on Harris Ridge at this point.
Yeah. They
haven't even moved in. It's not going to be until the evening of July 2nd. They move into the Seminary Ridge line. We do see Heath. I mean, he's got the bandage on his head. He's there, but doesn't really play much of a role there at all.
Exactly. So it's kind of a really weird looking guy who I guess is playing Lafayette McLaws. Doesn't look anything like McLaws. I still haven't figured out who McLaws
is there.
I think it's the guy with the long white beard, the ZZ Top beard. I think that's supposed to be McLaws.
Okay.
And then, of course, for superfan Doug, Barksdale shows up. Mississippi is ready. But we also get our introduction to John Bell Hood, who plays an important part in this segment of the movie. Again, they're emphasizing the importance. Longstreet says, I don't want to go in with one boot off. But Hood's saying, well, if he's right, the war is over by sundown. And, we're kind of now setting that stage. This is the decisive battle that we win. The war is going to be over.
So our next scene is we see Arthur Fremantle. Very interesting scene, and I think gets into a little bit of the lost cause propaganda a little bit here. And so let's kind of delve into this. I don't think we want to spend too much time into it, but I think it is memorable.
It's memorable dialogue, which is, again, part of the reason why we're doing this. Fremantle goes into the whole same land, same God, different dreams. And then Longstreet comes back with, the one that I've always enjoyed. Well, we whooped you British twice, as I recollect, which anytime Eric goes to England, I always remind him that, we did whoop his British twice, as I recollect. Which, again, is kind of some good stuff from Longstreet. But again, in the extended scene, they go on, and Longstreet talks about forcing Meade to attack them near Washington, while Fremantle rebuts with a pro-Lee rant that we're actually going to attack here, because Meade expects a flank move. Brilliant. General Lee is the ultimate strategist. And again, I think if you had left that scene in, it would have given a little more context to why, Lee is revered as a strategist. So again, some memorable stuff. Shall we move on to the countermarch?
Move into the countermarch.
Let's move into the countermarch. Oh, there is no countermarch. That's right. Again, we get more soul searching about the boys in blue from Lee and Longstreet. They never really felt like the enemy. Again, we're obviously trying to hit the audience over the head with this, we're all brothers and we're all Americans message. About the only thing missing here is we don't have Armistead crying again about Hancock.
We also have them talk about the heat.
Yeah.
Heat's like Mexico.
Right.
Which I just envision this. You're about to plan this major attack and you guys are talking about the weather. There, it was a dry heat. I don't know. It's like what people actually say when you talk about the weather.
Yeah, well,
It's not the heat, it's the humidity.
Yeah, right. Well, hey, we all take away different things from this. So any actual drama and real frustration that Longstreet experienced about the countermarch is, of course, totally absent from the movie. Just don't get it. We get a brief morning service from Father Corby. I guess that's supposed to be Corby. Watch closely for any Catholics in the audience. The actor does the sign of the cross backwards. Just a little trivia there. He was played by the old head of my hometown, Buffalo, New York Civil War Roundtable, a man who definitely knew the right way to do the sign of the cross. Vincent shows up, orders Chamberlain to that hill. What hill? Well, we'll find out, because the rebels are all stacking up on our left. We get a memorable rant from John Bell Hood about the enemy could just roll rocks down on us. And Longstreet says, you got to take that hill. So we're quickly kind of setting the stage here for the second day attack.
At this point, they're not thinking about that hill. They're not looking at this, as we discussed in our Peach Orchard episodes. Really, this is not the Confederate plan at that moment. The movie doesn't really give that nuance there, but of course, it is some memorable scenes. And also, as we get into the fight itself, to me, does it look like John Bell Hood is leading the Texas Brigade into Devil's Den?
Absolutely.
Now, I don't know, but last time I checked, Hood by this point is already out of the fight. He's already wounded. And I believe someone asked the Union troops in that area, is that depicting the 124th New York, which as far as I can tell it is.
Yes, right.
It seems to depict the Texas Brigade against the Orange Blossoms. What was interesting to me, though, in that entire scene, nobody has a Third Corps insignia. Once again, is this an example of anti-Third Corps bias in this movie? I think we're seeing a lot of evidence of this.
The anti-Sickles media strikes again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is anti-Sickles propaganda, folks.
Yeah, exactly. And you're right. Hood is leading an attack in Devil's Den against this nameless, sort of faceless corps of soldiers in blue. Why are they in Devil's Den? I don't know, but they just are. And it's a big pile of rocks, which again, most of us will recognize as being the actual Devil's Den. Even the guy who takes a swan dive off of one of the rocks. But why are they in Devil's Den? They never really tell us, which does lead, though, to something that I've always noticed. As we go now to the 20th Maine and Strong Vincent, personally and rather slowly leading the regiment into position on foot while the shells land pretty close by. This is, I believe, I could be wrong, tell me if I'm wrong, but this could be the only reference to Sickles that is made in the novel. Now, in the novel, as Vincent is leading the 20th Maine into position and shakes his handsome head, Sickles has got us in one hell of a jam. That damn fool Sickles. You know him, the bully boy. You know the one, the politician from New York. Fella shot his wife's lover. The Barton Key affair. Well, the damn fool was supposed to fall in on the left of Hancock right there. So in the book, you get a general sense of why the 20th Maine is being rushed into position. You don't get any of that in the movie. You just get the idea that, okay, the Rebs are stacking up on our left and we're going to move you to that hill over there. Again, I can understand why they cut this stuff, but 4.5 hour movie, but kind of feels like a wasted opportunity to throw a little more drama in there. Or we're just biased and we want more Sickles.
Well, we always want more Sickles. And before we leave the Devil's Den area completely, I do want to point out for a lot of visitors, the scene in 1992 when they're recording in Devil's Den looks a lot different than what Devil's Den looks like today. You see it's a lot more wooded in that area. Of course, in the subsequent years, the Park Service has done a magnificent job of clearing out that area in the Devil's Den, the slaughter pen, the triangular field, getting it back to what Sickles and Hood would have seen on that day.
Yeah. Since the movie, they've cut a lot of stuff. Frankly, a lot of the stuff is growing back as we sit here in 2019. But yeah, fair enough. Okay, so should we go then to what is arguably the most significant contribution to the movie in the book? Basically, the elevation of the 20th Maine on Little Round Top. All right, should we go there?
Is this the point where Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain ascends into heaven, or does that happen later?
It starts now, and I think it continues for the next 6 hours, or however long part one of the movie is still got left. So a couple thoughts. I know friends who are not battlefield guides and intend to think all we do as battlefield guides is talk about St. Joshua because that's what the public wants to hear. As I said before, I started coming here in 1995. I think definitely the Chamberlain myth was alive and well then. When I started guiding in 2003, I had a lot of people interested in this, but a lot of people didn't care or know. A lot of people didn't know about the 20th Maine. And I would say in 2019, I think a lot of that hoopla has died. I get almost very few, let me put it this way, I get very few general visitors who say, oh yeah, show me where that college professor from Maine fought. And I wish, frankly, some of that would come back because I think we need it. I just want to start with that caveat. What do you think, Eric?
Yeah, I had actually a tour last week. A gentleman retired from the Marine Corps. He had read The Killer Angels.
Yeah.
And he said, I really want to see where Chamberlain fought. And I said, well, we can go up there. Let's go up and see where it is. But I said, I also want to take you on to the other side of Little Round Top so you can get this view out here. And I think for a lot of guides, we would prefer to set up on the open face of Little Round Top looking out towards the west because you get a better sense of the ground from there than you really do from the position of the 20th Maine. But occasionally we do get people, or I'll mention that over on our left, the 20th Maine is going to launch a counterattack that drives back the Alabamians, and people go, oh, that's Chamberlain, right? Yes, that's Chamberlain.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So they're aware of him, but I don't think it's this need to actually be on the ground where he was in most cases.
Certainly not like I imagine it was in the mid-90s, even less, like I said, when I started in 2003. But the idea here is, the movie now, Chamberlain is giving a pep talk to the guys, we are the flank. If we give up this position, the Rebs are just going to go up over the hill, and the whole line is going to collapse. I mean, Strong Vincent says it in the movie. Chamberlain says it a couple of times. So, obviously here, this is one of the most important things that comes out of the movie, this idea that the 20th Maine has got to hold their position or the whole flank of the army is going to cave in. I personally don't have a particular issue with the focus on the 20th Maine. Obviously, the whole damn Reb army coming this way stuff is grossly over-exaggerated, but two things always kind of rustle my jimmies. The first rustling of my jimmies on this episode. I often see many people on Facebook who say things like, well, people think Little Round Top is important because of the movie. Wrong. Go back, read your Gettysburg historiography. The whole Meade-Sickles controversy is often built around the failure to defend what Meade called the key to my position. Read the attack and defense of Little Round Top, Oliver Wilcox Norton and things like that. The importance of Little Round Top was something debated by the veterans of the battle. It is not an invention of the movie, and I see that on Facebook sometimes or social media, and it really kind of annoys me. The other thing, though, too, is this is the point where people are going to throw up their hands and say, I want to see Culp's Hill. Why don't we have David Ireland instead of Chamberlain? As we said in the last episode, and it's worth repeating again, Ireland is not in the book, folks. Culp's Hill is not in the book. Just go with it. It's Chamberlain and the 20th Maine in the book. That's the story you're being told.
When I interpret Little Round Top, I often make the point that people will say that history is written by the victors. To me, on Little Round Top, it's written by the guys that survive.
Mm-hmm.
And we look at someone like Strong Vincent. We look at someone like Patrick O'Rourke or Charles Hazlitt or Stephen Weed. They're not making it off that hill alive. Who do we use?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we use the guy that lives
and writes
for almost
about
50 years after the war, visits the battlefield most often, and writes a lot about his experiences. It's Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. It's not that we're somehow giving him more credit than he deserves, but frankly, he gives us some of the best accounts of that fighting over a period of time.
Duty is going to demand we do a Chamberlain 20th Maine episode at some point, and I relish that challenge. I look forward to that. But again, for the people who say, well, he embellished things in his memoirs, folks, read any Civil War memoir. Everybody did. I mean, come on. That's not unique to Chamberlain in any way, shape, or form. It's just on Little Round Top at Gettysburg, which most of us have heard of.
We now move into maybe the most famous scenes of the Battle of Gettysburg depicted in the movie. This is that attack and defense of Little Round Top and the 20th Maine. It's certainly a very iconic scene in this movie. Some things we think they get right, some things not so much, but it's a very vivid scene in the minds of many fans of this movie.
Obviously it goes on for quite a while. Again, this notion that the whole rebel army is coming at us rather than, the 15th and the 47th Alabama. Kind of lose track over how many Confederate regiments arrive on the scene. A new one has arrived and is moving against the left. And this seems like this happens 3 or 4 times. So again, that feels a little exaggerated. I think some of the stuff like where they refuse the flank, I think that scene's actually very nicely done. Probably as close as we can get to kind of envisioning, how that sort of thing happens. And again, as I said before, these tactics and maneuvers in the book were influencing a young Ken Burns somewhere, who would also later popularize this in the PBS series. But Buster gets wounded, of course, a little bit of a tearjerker there.
In the bloody armpit.
In the bloody armpit. Like I said, I like the fighting. I like the scene. My only real grievance is the rebels just seem to have endless reinforcements. I think maybe it's 6. As in every Hollywood movie, there's always a couple scenes of hand-to-hand combat. Every Civil War attack in a movie always ends with fist fight kind of thing. But also, too, then, in various scenes then where you show the dead and the wounded down on the ground, I'd swear to God that, in this movie, the 15th Alabama loses like 5,000 guys alone, because there's just dead bodies and wounded guys everywhere, which to me just it looks a little Hollywooded up. But it's well done. It's a good scene. I can understand why people have been, struck by it all these years.
And for me, one thing I think they do get right, you mentioned when they refuse the line, the way that looks. My one quibble would be I think the 20th Maine's flanks are probably a little closer together.
Yeah, right.
There's some accounts that almost make it look almost like a hairpin.
Right.
There
right,
at one point, how pushed back they are.
On top.
You do see some hand-to-hand fighting there. I think there is going to be a tough, vicious fight on that rocky spur. But what this scene really, I think, conveys to a lot of people is... We kind of touched on it. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is a college professor. He's not a trained soldier.
Yeah.
Now, he's not the sort of bumbling professor that sometimes he's made out to be. He's not this total novice to being a soldier. He's been in the Army for over a year at this point. He has some experience. He also worked under a very good officer in Adelbert Ames, who was the first colonel of the 20th Maine that I think he learned a lot from. But Chamberlain speaks to a lot of people because here is an ordinary guy in an extraordinary event that makes the right decision and saves the day. And I think for a lot of us, we may not be able to relate to Robert E. Lee. We may not be able to relate to a Winfield Scott Hancock, but we can relate to a teacher. We can relate to just a everyday guy that's now in this really tough situation but saves the day. It's, I think, what we all sort of aspire to in many ways. We hope that if we were in that situation, that we could do the same. And I think that's why Chamberlain really resonates. So, of course, yells at the top of his lungs, bayonets. There's a whole debate whether or not that even happened.
Yeah.
But I think it's the symbolism of that sticks with people.
Yeah, I would say, when he yells bayonets and then charge in the movie, frankly, you're inhuman if you don't get fired up by that. They got the music pumping and, the guys running and all that stuff. Is an action scene. It's just not that badly done. I would also add, too, talking about why people like Chamberlain and they're inspired by him. When I get the Chamberlain naysayer on the battlefield tour, the guy who says, oh, that's all exaggerated. I heard in the coffee shop this morning that this fight didn't mean anything and nothing was saved. I always use the analogy that you did, that, look, this is the idea of kind of the common man. But also, too, Chamberlain is ordered to stand his ground and don't give up. And he doesn't. And it's a story of perseverance. It's a guy who basically doesn't give up. And, because of that, the regiment doesn't give up, and they hold their ground, on a day and on a battle when a lot of other people are running. And I think, to me, that's what I always try to impart on the importance of this. If you don't want to think Chamberlain saved the flank of the army, fine, I would agree with you on that. But it doesn't make it a less interesting story just to know that you got this one regiment led by the former college professor who isn't going to give up his position and is going to fight back no matter what. And to me, that's what I try to tell people is, part of what should be the inherent interest here, and just cut off all this crap with, the naysaying and the Chamberlain backlash, which frankly I'm totally sick of.
And to those who say, well, the hill doesn't matter, we can argue the strategic merits of Little Round Top.
We will in a future episode. Yeah.
There's a difference between we looking at this from 30,000 feet with the hindsight of history at our backs to the guys that are actually up there on that hill.
Yeah.
To the guys that are taking bullets up there, the guys that are getting shot up there, it matters.
Yeah.
To the families that lost a loved one on Little Round Top, it matters. I don't think you can tell those people it didn't matter. It just depends on what level we're looking at here. But I think over time, I think there's a natural inclination in our society when you do have somebody who is a hero and is sort of built up. There's always going to be the pushback.
Oh, yeah, always going to tear him down.
It's coming.
Yeah.
And I think Chamberlain gets that a little bit.
I think more than a little bit. I think he gets that a lot of bit.
Chamberlain does his job that day.
Damn right he does.
There's nothing wrong with what he did. I will make the point, though, that Little Round Top was a team effort.
Yeah.
If Chamberlain doesn't do what he does, it doesn't matter what Patrick O'Rourke does.
Right.
If O'Rourke doesn't do what he does, I don't know if it matters what Chamberlain did.
Right.
Or if you don't have the stand of the 44th New York or the 83rd Pennsylvania or other units up there. Or if Warren never gets up there and does what he does. I said, it's a team effort, but it doesn't take away from what Chamberlain did. He made all the right calls at that spot on the field at that moment.
Yeah, and maybe the Chamberlain naysayers would feel better if all of those other guys were included in the movie. You know, if you saw more of Warren and, you know, another shout out to the 83rd Pennsylvania for superfan Paul. Like you said, I don't really know what gets in people's craws about Chamberlain other than this notion that people don't like to see somebody else being popular. And like you said, Chamberlain became very popular in the 90s. People got sick of talking about him. They have done their damnedest since then to kind of tear him back down to earth, which, you know, I'm not a fan of.
And of course, people move on to other units too. I mean, I feel like every 5-year period, there's a certain unit that's very popular. And the 20th Maine was that. And then we kind of move on to somebody else. I mean, everybody seems to really be on an Iron Brigade kick.
Oh, yeah.
And at times I question the Iron Brigade and people look at me, oh my gosh,
I know, right.
the Iron Brigade.
The Black Hats, yeah.
Well,
everybody seems to be an Iron Brigade fanboy right now. That's true.
You know, I'm...
Yeah.
But maybe that's just the native North Carolina.
Yeah, okay.
You know, we're the ones that pushed him back, but that's another episode altogether.
Yeah. And so back to the sort of the historical aspect of it. Again, we would be remiss if we didn't point out, you know, Chamberlain, by most accounts, I think really including his own, you know, did not order charge. You know, he did not order a bayonet charge in the classic Hollywood description. The real Ellis Spear was probably rolling over in his grave during the height of Chamberlain mania. And the whole thing about, well, we're going to swing like a gate. All of that is exaggerated, both in the book and later in the movie. And it's helped perpetuate this notion that Chamberlain did more up on the hill than he really did. What I do want to talk about in our 20th Maine episode, though, is sort of now the opposite of that. Why does everybody believe Ellis Spear and nobody believes Joshua Chamberlain? But we're already well over an hour and a half on this episode, probably, so we'll leave that for another time. Say goodbye, though, to Buster, as he's hit twice in the bloody armpit, one of the mechanics of nature. Spoiler alert for July 3rd, poor Buster doesn't make it.
Buster doesn't make it. And if you are ever here on the battlefield and you go to the main section of the Soldiers National Cemetery, or you go to the monument of the 20th Maine on Little Round Top, you will not find Kilrain's name on it. We should add he is a fictional character.
Very
he is
fictional.
not real. But I think it speaks to the performance in the movie that people identify with him and people want to see him and honor him and remember him. And so I think it does show the influence the movie has there.
I'll challenge that a little bit. Battlefield Guide, Legend and Lore. Now again, 1995, 2019, very different eras. But again, I often read on social media, oh, the Battlefield Guides will tell you everyone is looking for Buster Kilrain's grave. Boy, in 18 years of guiding, if I've had that happen once, I am having a hard time remembering that. I will tell you in some instances, I've even taken the initiative and said, oh, you won't find Kilrain. And somebody will go, who? Who are you talking about? And I'll say, oh, the little Irish guy in the movie. And I'll get kind of a blank stare from the audience and I'll kind of move on. So again, I'm not saying that's a myth. I'm sure in 1995, 1996, Battlefield Guides had a lot of a problem with that. But I don't know. I mean, you do a lot of tours. Do you get that? Do you get people looking for Kilrain? I don't.
Occasionally. I mean, people will look, especially if they look at the names there. If they look at that and they've seen the movie, it's usually people that want to do a more Killer Angels focused tour. I do get that still. Of course, as we have seen recently, you'll find people on social media that bash us guides for everything.
Exactly.
You know?
So again, it's a very dramatic moment. The charge of the 20th Maine, they scoop up scores of prisoners. I think there's a nice touch when Tom Chamberlain introduces that one rebel officer and
Captain Hopkins.
Is that what the guy's name is? Yes. And the guy just says, "Can I have some water?" I think that's a nice touch.
And that's historically accurate.
Yeah, I know.
How many guys in those Alabama regiments were wanting some water by that point?
I know. I think that's a nice touch. I like that. And then you kind of have a funny moment where I think it's supposed to be Colonel Rice. I think it's supposed to be Rice who kind of comes down and says, "That was the damnedest thing I ever saw. May I shake your hand, sir?" And then Chamberlain says, "By the way, what's the name of the hill? Little Round Top. That's the name of the hill. And now you're going to go to Big Round Top." And Chamberlain kind of says, "Well, I guess I'll remember that." Again, you got to separate history from the movie here. You've got to kind of tell the audience the name of the hill you just did, so I get that. But obviously, as almost any good Gettysburg scholar will tell you, they were not calling it, and Chamberlain certainly wasn't calling it Little Round Top or Big Round Top during the Battle of Gettysburg. So again, a little artistic license there, but I'm sure many people sort of snicker every time they see that moment.
One of the biggest areas of interpretation that has been influenced is the moment Little Round Top is held. It's as if now the Union line has been saved on July 2nd. As we all know, there's still fighting going on at the wheat field at this moment.
Right.
There's still fighting going on north of the peach orchard. There's fighting heading towards Cemetery Ridge. Culp's Hill's about to fire up here in a few moments. So there's a lot going on, but I think it influences people's thinking into how the second day of the battle plays out. Because if we think about the movie, Little Round Top saved.
And it's over.
We're flipping the disc, and we're moving over now to July 3rd.
I agree. And you're right, as we flip the disc now, we kind of go into the aftermath of July 2nd. Now, again, this is, for the most part, Chamberlain and the 20th Maine have a much greatly diminished role in the movie at this point. Again, as I said in part one, critics then and now have kind of commented that they think this seriously weakens the second half of the movie. I could be in a minority. I actually think the second half of the movie is better than the first half. And so, but again, as we sort of now turn to Longstreet and sort of him coming to terms with the attack, you have again the great moment with Hood in the field hospital, the memorable line, "Should have let me go to the right," which again is perhaps the most quoted line from the entire movie. So again, I just would be remiss if we did not cover that.
And what struck me is when he's visiting with Hood and when he later has his meeting with Robert E. Lee, it's still daylight.
Yeah, right.
This fighting on July 2nd in that area is ending by about 8:30.
Right.
So it's not going to be light out. And also this idea that during the day, the Longstreet says, "All right, guys, got to go see Hood. I got to go see the general." And we also have some questions to the communications that are going to be going on at this time between Lee and Longstreet at this juncture in the battle.
Yeah, there's another scene with Harrison where more Shakespeare is quoted. I was just going to not mention that because you're right. The next thing then is back at Lee's headquarters. And as you said, Longstreet having a meeting with Lee, which historically almost everyone agrees did not happen after the close of fighting on July 2nd. And you might think that's kind of nitpicky, but it's not if you want to get into the whole controversy over what Longstreet thought they were going to do on July 3rd. By the way, again, Eric, I got to point this out. The band is serenading Lee and Longstreet again. What is up with that?
Hey, bands have to do something.
I guess I have to do something.
Which also, here's a nitpick I have. In the middle of a battle, these bands are not playing music. They're back at hospitals.
Yeah, right.
They're running stretches.
Right,
They're doing some pretty serious work. And I've sometimes had people on tours, when you do talk to military bands, people say, "Oh, man, that would be the job I want."
Right.
I'm like, you know what? I don't want to be lugging stretchers around. I don't want to be holding guys down, amputating their legs. I don't want to be doing that.
Yeah.
I think it kind of takes away from the reality of what a Civil War battlefield would have looked like compared to the depiction that Gettysburg does. And this is where one quibble I have also is, it's not bloody enough.
Yeah, right. It's not graphic enough.
And this is where people go, "Oh my gosh, he's bloodthirsty." No. Let's look at, say, the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan.
I mean, there's no comparison.
Compared to what Gettysburg is.
Yeah.
It's just as ugly. It's just as brutal.
Yeah.
It's almost very nice.
Oh, yeah.
In the movie Gettysburg.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not seeing guys' limbs getting torn off, jaws getting ripped off. You're not seeing that.
Well, that goes though to what we said in part one. People talk about the novel being anti-war and the most realistic war novel ever. And I'm like, really? I mean, maybe I've just seen the movies so many more times than I've read the book. I don't find the movie particular. Well, it's certainly not graphic. And, maybe they felt they had to do that for TV or whatever. But I don't feel like it's all anti-war either. I mean, it kind of makes the Civil War kind of glamorous. You got the band playing, type of stuff. Awesome poker games at night. Just doesn't, to me, make the Civil War all of that ugly.
And your point of TV is probably why it was not that. If this was going to be a theatrical release first,
right,
it probably would have been a little bloodier than what it is. Because we do have Saving Private Ryan coming out, I guess, 5 years after in the theaters.
Yeah.
But I think this is where their view of what Civil War combat looks like.
Rules, guys, playing by rules and type of stuff. It comes from stuff like that. So I agree. I mean, I agree with you. That's an important stamp kind of on interpretation.
And one account I will always use when we talk about Civil War combat doesn't come from Gettysburg, but one Union soldier will remember that at times in combat, the units were so close that he said we fought more by sound than we did sight. And he'd make the point that if we fired a volley and we heard sharp cracks, we're hitting arms and legs.
Yeah.
If we hear a dull thud, we're hitting chest and torso. That doesn't get carried out in this movie. I mean, we see wounded soldiers, we see dead soldiers, but we don't see the brutality of it, which I think has altered the way we view Civil War combat at times. I think for some visitors, they're shocked how ugly and horrific it really is.
Yeah, absolutely. So should we go on to Stuart Returns?
Absolutely.
Again,
my favorite scene of the movie.
The band is playing. Well, we're not quite there yet. Stuart returns and the prodigal son is returned. So kind of it's another anti-Stuart dig. But, now we get a scene, the Lee Longstreet meeting, which did not happen in real life, but does happen in the meeting. Again, I think just another bad scene for Sheen and Lee. I mean, Lee looks positively unhinged off his rocker at this moment. As he sort of stares off into space. They nearly broke. I could feel them breaking. I could see a clear road all the way to Washington. I mean, the guy looks, more exhausted than the guys who were probably doing the actual combat on July 2nd. Just not a good moment for Lee. Longstreet, though, comes off as all wise and all-knowing. General, that way around the right is still open. And, Lee just doesn't want to hear from it. Lee's too tired and sleepy. And
he's having a heart attack.
And wants to wrap himself up in his shawl rather than talk about what do next. And I think if you sort of compare that to the opening of the movie where Lee is kind of strong in some of these opening scenes. I mean, the guy is just deteriorated in like 48 hours, which kind of feels like we're in the 48th hour of the movie. I'm concerned for Robert E. Lee's health at this point.
So can we move on to Jeb now?
I did have the camp scene.
So, all right, another camp scene. Let's go to it.
Another Confederate campfire scene. I don't know how many movies can have multiple Confederate camp scenes, but we got a couple of these. Anyone remember Star Trek V, where Kirk, Spock, and Bones repeatedly went camping? This is even worse than that. I mean, they just keep going here. But again, a classic line moment. Darwin and the descended from ape scene, by George Pickett. Again, another classic line of dialogue. Now, again, I'm no Darwin expert. I've seen some debate over the years over whether or not this conversation could have actually occurred in 1863. I don't know if it did, but I'm guaranteeing it sure as hell did not happen in the Confederate camp on July 2nd, 1863. Hey, Longstreet, how about those ghastly casualties we suffered today? No, we can't. We're talking about evolution. Come on.
And keep in mind, we didn't start teaching evolution in the South until about 15 years ago.
Right. So yeah, exactly. So it's kind of like this to me is like, why the hell is this scene even in the movie? I mean, when critics talk about it being self-indulgent, kind of what it feels like. Armstead walks into Longstreet's tent like an equal. Hey, Longstreet, I'm just gonna come and slum in your tent for the night. That's kind of why I asked Wayne in the last episode, what is even the relationship between these two guys? But we have more singing. I guess the band is taking a rest. So while the band is not playing music for once, we're going to have a guy singing in his tent, which, like everything else in this movie, brings Armistead to tears.
And not just any singing. That boy can sing.
That boy can sing. Exactly. More classic dialogue. So we have the movie moment, where, hey, you'll give my Bible and my stuff to Elmira Hancock. But, if I were Longstreet, I think I would slap Armistead by this point and said, look, get your head into the game. He's talking about the breakup and I need to go over and see Wynn as soon as possible. Dude, Armistead, get your head into the game.
Or break a plate over his head.
Right. Yeah, right. A boyish frolic.
A boyish frolic.
Again, if I raise a hand against you, may God strike me dead. As we pointed out last week, that is by almost certainly a historical inaccuracy. Armistead's primary motivation was to his home state. But again, seriously misleading in my opinion, but contributes to this, sort of tragic bromance that we've got going on in the movie. Which now gets us probably to one of your favorite moments. Stuart meets Lee.
Finally, Stuart and Lee. And the takeaway I always get with this is historically, Stuart and Lee almost had a father-son type relationship. Lee knew Stuart at West Point. Stuart was with Lee at Harper's Ferry in 1859. Lee knew of Stuart. Lee was very fond of Stuart. And this scene almost reminds me of that moment where the dad's like, son, I'm taking the keys to the car. Hand them over. And Stuart is just so crestfallen, beaten down. And of course, there's the famous, there is no time for that. And then, Lee kind of gets back into the, you'll learn from this like a man does. To me, though, Stuart meeting with Lee that night, Stuart's got some work going on in real life at this time. He's out on Brinkerhoff Ridge. This is the final sort of smackdown of Jeb Stuart that we need, because there's not been a positive depiction of Stuart in this entire movie.
No, you can't.
At all.
You can't possibly come away from the movie or the book and have a favorable impression of Jeb Stuart. It really can't happen. I think most serious Stuart scholars don't even think the dress down happened. So, again, like you said, there is no time. It's a great moment from Lee. I'm tired of seeing this guy sitting in his rocking chair. I want to see a little fire from General Lee, and we get it here. They said about Lee, when he got mad all over, and we don't see that in the movie. And you can kind of wonder how Tommy Lee Jones or even Charlton Heston would have handled that moment. But like you said, he's dressing Stuart down, but then he kind of reins it in and says, reminds him of his service and his value as a cavalry officer. And, but there's been a mistake. Well, gee, I wonder whose mistake, General Lee, because you're the one who gave him those vague orders. But that's, again, probably for another episode. So, the movie, you're not going to come out of the movie with a good impression of Ewell. You're not going to come out of the movie with a good impression of Stuart. You're not going to come out of the movie with a good impression of that guy who told Chamberlain to shoot the 2nd Maine. So some guys just kind of get a raw deal in this movie, and Jeb Stuart's clearly one of them.
So the next scene we now have is morning coffee with the Chamberlain brothers.
Yeah, they're on one of the round tops. I presume it's supposed to be Big Round Top. Although, again, if I'm not mistaken, isn't this the scene where we see the Warren Monument behind them?
Yes, this is.
Yeah, and I knew that because we see kids climbing on the rocks or something, like you would on the battlefield. But again, there's sort of a weird diversion that Chamberlain hears, shooting off in the distance. Like, what is that? There wasn't, any diversion on the morning of July 3rd. I don't understand what that's all about. But after a break to Lee and Longstreet, we're going to come back to the Chamberlains, where the courier comes up and sends our gang from the 20th Maine smack dab into the center. Don't worry, safest spot on the battlefield.
And now that I think about it, you mentioned the diversion. The only thing I could think of is maybe they're depicting some of the cannonading going on in the Culp's Hill vicinity.
Boy, that would be...
But, if you want your Culp's Hill
there you go.
fixed, there's Culp's Hill in the morning of July 3rd. Right. There you go. Culp's Hill's in the movie.
I think I can even hear Colonel Ireland yelling for reinforcements or something.
I can,
yeah. Turn the sound up high, folks.
Yeah, I think I can even hear the 1st Maryland Battalion going in.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
But we all know, with hindsight, the safest part of the line, the center. Well, we all know that's not going to be a safe place in a few hours. This serves a couple purposes in the book, and it serves a purpose in the movie, because if you are a writer of fiction, you have all these characters. You have to connect them somehow. You can't just have a major character like Joshua Chamberlain in the 20th Maine just on Big Round Top the whole time. So we got to move them into that area. Now, this is where history meets Hollywood.
Okay.
Because the 20th Maine is moved into Cemetery Ridge, just not the section we consider part of the Pickett's Charge area of operations. So they're on the ridge, but they're not in the angle. And I think as we'll see subsequently, when we look at Chamberlain, we look at Tom, we look at the 20th Maine, they don't fight. Mm-hmm. They're not heroes of July 3rd.
No,
they're there, but they're just, actually, for lack of a better term, they're there.
Yeah, they're there, like a lot of other units who are played out from July 2nd, kind of in Cemetery Ridge, near where the New Jersey Brigade Monument is today, kind of in that general area. And I will say this is an area that has had influence. I know of many times over the years where I have had people on battlefield tours, and they have had, this is where this is where the 20th Maine moves, and you got to explain to them that that's pretty big departure. So yeah, I mean, if I was writing a book, I get it. I'm not going to have the big climax with the star of my book, not even there. Is it historic? No, but I can at least understand why they did it. The part of it in the movie that I do kind of find it funny, though, is the whole then Chamberlain-Hancock meeting. Here we are, a regimental colonel from the 5th Corps coming up to the commander of the 2nd Corps for orders. And, and Hancock, who, by the way, is in the movie much shorter than Chamberlain, much shorter. Hancock, first of all, says to Chamberlain, I want you to write a report, which, aren't you supposed to do that anyways?
It's kind of part of your job.
Yeah, and then, of course, the 2nd Corps commander unburdens himself to this colonel that he just met. And, again, gets all weepy and teary-eyed over Armstead, which again, I don't know what to do. I'm getting frustrated. You take it. I don't know what to do about this.
Let's look at it from the perspective of Hancock in the book and in the movie.
Yeah.
He's going through a bit of a rough patch with his relationship with Armstead.
Right.
And as we know, people, when they get into a rough patch, they tend to get a little weepy. They get a little sad. They unburden themselves to people they've just met.
Right. Subordinate officers, no less.
It happens. Who hasn't been there? So let's just understand that Hancock's having a bit of a rough patch.
All right. I'm going to start crying and unburdening myself to the listeners if this movie doesn't end at some point.
Well, I believe this movie's going to end fairly soon.
We're coming soon. Now, from there, it does go into several extended segments over the planning of Pickett's charge, and there's a couple of scenes rapid fire that, in my personal opinion, are among my favorite scenes of the movie. There's a couple glaring mistakes, and we'll talk about those, but in general, there's several repeated scenes here as they're planning Pickett's charge. This is really my favorite part of the movie. I think Pickett's charge, not the 20th Maine, is the best part of the movie. I think Pickett's charge is, overall, pretty damn well done. And let's talk about that. So we go into the planning for Pickett's charge. Again, there's a little mystical music in the background as Lee and Longstreet examine the position. Basically, Lee kind of summarizes the plan as, I want you to bring your corps forward, take those heights in the center, and split the Federal line. So I actually agree with Lee's plan on it, but for those of you who listened to our What Was Lee Thinking episode, obviously they've just sort of omitted a whole bunch of plan A, plan B, and the general plan was unchanged. And they're just kind of going to the heart of what really is the objective, I think, for July 3rd. Take the ridge, split the center, as I think what they're trying to do. It's not a great moment for Martin Sheen as Lee. Again, he's kind of staring off into space. I think Behringer's skepticism for Longstreet is actually very well played. The look on his face several times is kind of like, you're asking me to do what? I can even see that beneath the beard. But, again, Lee kind of stares off into space and says, in the center, they will break. And the one I really don't like is where Lee goes, I have never left the battlefield to the enemy. Really kind of comes off as an egomaniac who's, willing to just screw his whole army to satisfy his ego.
Lee's never left the field to the enemy. Sharpsburg, anybody? Anybody?
Well, that's a cute little battle,
That's a cute little battle.
Someday when they make a 4-hour movie out of it, we'll come back to that.
Actually,
one.
That's about as long as that battle lasted, wasn't it?
I think, right.
Now, all of a sudden, we're hearing about 45 miles down the road, massive explosions in the Sharpsburg, Maryland areas. We just made fun of Antietam.
Right.
We're just kidding, folks.
Right. Another great battle. Longstreet comes off well. Lee is increasingly not coming off well as this movie continues. We get a brief 20th Maine break, and then Lee and Longstreet return to continue planning. They gallop the hell out of their horses in this one scene. Lee is visibly huffing and puffing when they get off the horse, but it kind of looks cool, and this is a visual medium, and this is where Lee now agrees to give Longstreet Pettigrew and Trimble to replace Hood and McLaws. They mention the clump of trees as an objective, so I kind of groan at that a little bit, but then now Lee elaborates too that the artillery is going to break up the enemy, which was indeed a critical component of the plan.
And of course, this excited me as a North Carolinian when all of a sudden I hear the name Pettigrew. Finally, we're getting away from all these Virginians from once. If I have to hear about old Virginia again, my head's going to explode. But
Yeah,
this does start to introduce some of the primary characters that we're going to see on July 3rd in what will later be called the Pickett, Pettigrew, Trimble assault.
It's funny. I can't believe I've been remiss in mentioning that, because obviously as I was watching the movie, knowing your state pride in North Carolina and just going on and on about Virginia's here, I thought of you, man. I thought that you'd probably be, rustled a little bit by just the total lack of fair play that North Carolina gets in this movie.
Yeah, we see Pettigrew's brigade very briefly. There is actually a scene that depicts the 26th North Carolina in Pickett's charge, where the unit gets double canister at their face. Of course, that didn't actually happen.
Yeah.
That's a whole other episode altogether. But yeah, to me, when I come away watching the movie Gettysburg, I sort of get the sense that often the Army of Northern Virginia is abbreviated ANV.
Yeah.
To me, it makes me think ANV stands for Army of Nothing But Virginians. And so it's kind of like, all right, you give Mississippi credit, but what about, the guys that 1 in 4 dead of the Confederate Army are going to come from this state? I will say, though, the portrayal of Pettigrew is pretty good.
Well, you think?
Yeah, I kind of like him a little bit.
You think?
I think, he is sort of a little bumbling with the, get my book. As
an author, though, I can relate to the pride.
I can relate to that.
The pride. You want to show your commanding officer your book. And like I carry books in the trunk of my car, he carries them in his saddlebag.
Absolutely. And people ask, did Pettigrew actually have a book? He did.
Yeah, he did.
It was actually more of a travel log.
I know, Spain and the Spaniards.
He goes into Spain, Sardinia. He goes into also Italy. Pettigrew travels through Europe during this time of revolution and keeps trying to get involved in a revolution. But every time he gets there, the revolution's over.
Yeah, okay.
So it's kind of, a little hilarious. We might talk about that in our next episode coming up.
I mean, I'm a little surprised that you're good with Pettigrew's performance in the movie, because obviously Pettigrew is way too old. He is portrayed by ex-James Bond, George Lazenby. If I'd been here in the summer of 1992, you got Berenger, you got Jeff Daniels here. I want to hang out with James Bond, which I would have loved to have heard some stories.
Well, Pettigrew was kind of a James Bond guy, a well-learned guy, spoke different languages,
All right, let's just keep moving on here. So, but going back to the Lee Longstreet planning, Longstreet objects with that. I've been a soldier all my life. And again, I think it's a really good scene. Berenger looks visibly pissed. Again, just don't look at the beard. Just kind of go for it here. Longstreet says, perhaps Hill should lead the attack. And Lee kind of looks over his shoulder like, oh my God, I hope nobody's listening to this. I think it's a really good moment. It's arguably my favorite scene in the movie. And Lee then turns around and says, there is no one I trust more. And can we take this hill? We can and we will. So, the last hour or so has not been good for Robert E. Lee, but I kind of like this scene. I think it's a good one. Pickett rides up, gives his little yee-ow, when he's told he's going to lead the attack. And then we go into that great unscripted moment where all the reenactors are coming out and cheering Lee. That goes on, I timed it. That goes on for almost 3 freaking minutes of just, Lee and the music and the reenactors with the tan lines where they've taken off the wristwatches, just cheering Lee. Martin Sheen looks petrified on that horse. It's a great moment, and again, if you kind of watch this and you don't get pumped up by that, I think you're kind of inhuman in my opinion. So then we get yet another planning scene with Longstreet. I mean, the planning scenes are just kind of coming one on top of each other. But this is, again, as we said, where Pettigrew shows up and Trimble. Again, there's a pretty big goof where Longstreet is drawing the line in the dirt. It says, Trimble with Pettigrew in support. For the life of me, I can't understand why the historic advisors let him get away with that. Again, all I can think is we've already met Trimble in the movie. So the writer-director is kind of saying, we got to put Trimble in jeopardy. I mean, that's about the only thing I can think of.
It's anti-North Carolina bias.
There you go. That's what it is. Yeah, anything to keep these guys out of the movie. Again, there's some more references to the clump of trees. Pickett is a little too hammy for me in this scene. He's holding flowers. He's smiling. We get some more nonsense with Harrison about wanting to pick up a musket. And then, I don't know, Eric, at this point, are we just kind of ready to begin the charge?
Yeah, actually, after having watched this, I'd like to go through the charge myself. Put me out of my misery.
This is actually where I stopped watching the rewatch at this point. I've seen this movie enough to kind of know what happens next. But, the scene-by-scene breakdown, we kind of remember there's another speech kind of thing that, some of our super fans like Jody will fast forward through. But there's another speech where Fremantle and Armstead are talking about Virginia, the sons of Virginia. We're all here. And Chamberlain finds out Buster is dead. That's kind of a tearjerker of a moment. We kind of begin the charge, which, as I've said, I'll say it again, I think is the best part of the movie.
We look at probably depictions battle-wise. That's pretty spot on as Confederates are moving out of those woods. I think it looks pretty good. It certainly gets the heart racing.
Yeah.
You got the smoke. You got everything kind of there. I think visually it's very stunning.
I do too. I think they did a good job with it. I've heard people say over the years that they think the Pickett's charge in the movie is too small scale. I mean, obviously, I don't know how many reenactors they had. Obviously, they didn't have 12,000. I think it looks great. I will tell you, I saw the 25th anniversary re-showing at the Majestic Theater, I guess last year. It still held up on the big screen. I thought it was great. We've got Kemper riding his horse. We've got Garnet riding the horse. This is the one part of the movie where Armstead finally stops crying and does something important. The hat on the sword. On the Confederate side, I think the charge is pretty well played. On the Union side, you're distracted by the 20th Maine being where they shouldn't be. In the book, doesn't Chamberlain fall asleep during the cannonade?
Yes.
I don't know why you move him to somewhere where he's not and then just have him fall asleep. Unless Shara was trying to explain why he doesn't, pick up a musket and just save the day himself. I never really understood that.
Falling asleep in a battle, who does he think he is? John Reynolds?
Well, if he was Reynolds, he would have got captured.
That's very true.
Right,
Yeah, very
right.
true.
So we didn't talk about the cannonade. In general, that plays well. I mean, I know they're going in the wrong direction and there's no recoil on the guns and stuff like that. So that's a little visibly distracting. But as they approach the Emmitsburg Road, we get the Ted Turner cameo.
Yes.
Was Waller Tazewell Patton. Again, Turner is much older than Patton. Patton was only in his 20s. But I mean, come on. Turner forked over all this dough to make this movie for us, the Civil War enthusiasts. Give the guy his cameo, as he gets shot up against the Emmitsburg Road fence. Probably went home that night and promoted a wrestling card with Ole and Arn Anderson or something like that.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
Turner was everywhere during that era.
And actually, in this era, the Braves were doing pretty well, too.
Oh, yeah, they were.
So, Turner's flying high.
Yeah. Yeah, we're not quite at the era yet where the Yankees are going to beat up on the Braves in the World Series every year, but those quote-unquote glory years of the Braves are kind of starting.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I have to think about what happened the next year when they beat my Indians in the World Series.
Yeah,
but,
so...
yeah. Now I'm depressed. I'm not depressed over the attack. I'm depressed over that. But moving on.
Moving on. So, of course, the other cameo then is Ken Burns, right?
Yes.
This is kind of Hancock's big moment in the movie. There are times when a Corps commander's life does not count. And I've heard from informed sources that the actor who played Hancock was not happy to have the scene stolen by a boyish-looking Ken Burns grabbing the reins of the horse. Because obviously everybody watching it, more or less, knows that's Ken Burns saying, "Please, General, we cannot spare you," and you can't help but take your eyes off of Hancock at that moment. And again, I've been told by people in the know over the years that the actor who played Hancock was not happy with that cameo choice.
I also will give them high praise for the depiction of Hancock there. A lot of accounts of Hancock would say in battle that he was very cool, calm, and collected. Was not rattled. You've got all kinds of stuff breaking around him. Doesn't affect him. I think one of his staff officers would even say along the lines of, in battle, we always felt safe in the general's presence.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very accurate depiction of Hancock. I see no qualms with that. I mean, we can joke about, please, General, we cannot spare you. But I think the way it depicts Hancock is pretty accurate as far as who he was as an officer.
Oh, yeah, Hancock is fine. We need to get Ken Burns out of the scene is what we need to do, right? Sheen is too short to play Lee. Hancock is too short. To me, when that's most noticeable is when they're on horses, because one of the things you always heard was how impressive these guys were in the saddle. Look, I'm not that tall myself, but when you get a guy who's only like 5'6" in the saddle, you can try to pretend you're Hancock or Lee as much as possible, but it's just a little difficult to do. But we're quibbling at this point.
Yes, we are.
I think we're getting punched.
Quibbling.
We're getting punch drunk. Eric and I have now been talking about this movie for like 3 consecutive hours. We're getting a little punch drunk, folks. So what happens next, Eric? Do we just smash into the angle, and should we take care of Armistead at this point?
Let's kill off Armistead.
Yeah, so again, it's a pretty good moment in the movie. Armistead and his guys break over the wall. Again, there's some debate in real life over how far over the wall Armistead got. In the movie version, it's pretty clear he gets over the wall, turn the cannons, and he's shot. Which, of course, eventually, though, he's going to be rescued by not Captain Henry Bingham, but Tom Chamberlain, which is, again, another bit of dramatic license.
Yeah, I think that's very much a glaring issue. But, of course, we've got to connect these characters somehow.
Of course.
So this is how we're going to do that.
Of course.
It's around this time that we do have the cameo by the 26th North Carolina getting the double canister in their faces.
I forgot about that part.
But, there is, you see some of these scenes of the attack breaking. You see Longstreet watching it. You see Lee watching it. You get the dramatic music kicking in.
Yeah.
And basically at this point now, we have the attack failing, which I think now comes to, I think, one of the more dramatic scenes of the movie, where we have Lee riding out. General Pickett, look to your division.
Yeah.
And what does Pickett say?
Generally, I have no division. Tears streaming down his cheeks and things like that. Now, again, folks, there is probably some historical accuracy there. There are accounts that Pickett was in tears following this disaster. There are accounts that Cadmus Wilcox was in tears following this disaster. Probably quite a number of Confederate participants, just through the sheer shock and awe of this, were probably in tears following it. Closes out Pickett's version of the story. Again, you could come away with this kind of thinking, okay, Pickett's division is, shattered, 100% casualties. There's nobody left in sight. No, obviously, he's still got more or less 50% of his men left, and, they'll reform and kind of go on with their war. But at least as far as the movie is concerned, Stephen Lang and Pickett exit the screen at this point.
And as I watched this, there's a little bit of disconnect, because of course you'll have the scene where Robert E. Lee is apologizing. It's all my fault. And what gets lost in that is that a lot of the accounts, Lee is probably doing that to some extent, but he's doing it in the guise of, okay, now I need you to reform.
Yeah, reform
and get out of this. Rally, guys.
Rally behind me, kind of thing.
Come on, help me out. And I think you see Longstreet being the guy rallying, preparing, bring the guns up, in case they come. And Lee seems detached in this moment. Which I think doesn't really fit the historic record.
Longstreet does write about the fact that after the repulse of the charge, he did ride up towards some of the guns. So again, if you take Longstreet's word, that's historically accurate. Again, the scene where which staff officers is it, Gory, who gets thrown from the horse, then kind of says, "I'm intolerable, sir." It is, again, kind of another great line. But yeah, to your point, I agree with you. I kind of think of the "it's all my fault" scene as a total missed opportunity. I don't like the way they play it at all. I pray, friends, hear me. I just don't like the way they do that at all. So I don't think that's particularly well handled at all.
And I think also just from an acting perspective now, what I know about acting, I could put in a thimble. But with Lee, if you're in this moment in real life, you're scared out of your mind right now. There's a good chance they're coming pouring over that field at you here. You need to be ready. I don't think there's going to be this moment where it's more of, okay, guys, it's all right. It's all my fault. It's okay. Mm-hmm. I think it also sort of makes Lee seem very passive. In that moment, Longstreet's much more engaged.
Yeah, right.
Which is just,
that I agree with.
It doesn't fit well with what actually happened.
Yeah, and the other thing too that I'll throw in, because I know that from doing all my Pickett's charge tours over the year, I know this has had an impact. The last thing we see of Kemper. And again, I feel an affinity to movie Kemper because he's got some great screen rants during, the 5 or 6 campfire poker scenes. But, of course, we see Kemper on the stretcher, and the last line Kemper more or less has in the movie is, "They tell me my wound is mortal." I can tell you for a fact, I've had many people do Pickett's charge rewalks over the years who think Kemper dies because they saw it in the movie. And so I can tell you that's definitely misled. said, historic interpretation, folks, Jimmy Kemper does not die. He goes in as a prisoner of war and will be exchanged a few months later for Charles Graham, who was captured at the Peach Orchard.
And which corps was Charles Graham a part of?
3rd Corps under Dan Sickles, since you ask.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
And I think what gets left out, and you made the good point that people often think that Garnett, Armistead, and Kemper are all killed in this attack. We've forgotten about one brigade commander that will be killed in this attack.
Yeah.
James Marshall.
Well, who has
we don't even...
No appearance in the movie whatsoever.
I think Armistead mentions him when he talks about, his grandfather was Chief Justice John Marshall. He's going through all those Virginians, I believe.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, we think about, we have the one brigade commander that everybody thinks dies,
right.
who doesn't, and we have a brigade commander that dies, by all accounts, a very dramatic death.
Yeah. That nobody's ever heard of.
Mentions.
Yeah, nobody ever talks about.
Poor Jimmy Marshall.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that. And as a point that we brought up in our Pickett's Charge book, and I do on tours, the director's cut does have a brief scene with Trimble being wounded, so we at least kind of get to find out what happens to him.
And Pettigrew's wounded in this.
Yeah.
I think it would even have the scene where he gets shot.
Right.
Even just have him come back with a shattered hand.
Shattered James Bond Pettigrew trying to retrieve that book from his bag for Longstreet and just failing to do so. We missed Hancock's wounding, which is a fairly well done scene. I think the bullet and the pommel and the wood and the nails being driven into his groin. The groin is a little high on Hancock in the movie versus where he was probably really wounded.
Just hearing that, I'm hurting right now.
Yeah. But, again, the whole thing of, I will not move until this engagement's decided, get me a tourniquet, more or less accurate. Yeah. So we'll kind of go with that. What else? We didn't cover Garnett getting killed.
Yeah, we get Garnett basically, I guess, wiped out by artillery.
Blown away by some canister, right? Which, again, there are multiple accounts of how Garnett met his death. That may indeed be one of them. There are other accounts that said he was shot. Some said he was hit by artillery fire. We don't know. So the way they do it in the movie is perfectly acceptable to me.
Yeah, and they'll mention that his body was never located. His sword shows up in the pawn shop.
Right.
But of course, if this guy is getting hit by canister, there's not going to be anything left of him.
Right.
So I think there is, people ask, how do we know? Well, I think there's a probability that just there wasn't much left of him to be recognized.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it covers that as well.
Did we miss anybody? Have we killed off all the main characters at this point? Did we miss anybody? I know we're kind of going rapid fire here at the end, but did we miss anybody?
No, I think we're good.
I think we're good.
Well, we got to have the Chamberlain brothers embracing.
Yeah. So before we do that, should we close out on Lee Longstreet?
Yeah, let's do Lee Longstreet.
So our last view of Lee Longstreet is around the campfire. And obviously Lee is practically moved to tears. I know he and Longstreet had a close relationship. Would he allow the real Longstreet to see that? Boy, I kind of wonder about that. But again, it kind of goes with the clear screen deterioration we've seen of Robert E. Lee over the last couple of hours. And again, telling us, though, that, the Army's not broken. We're going to go on. We're going to fight another day before he screams out, "I am so tired." And, Longstreet kind of just sits there and says, "Hey, tell me what I can do." And, I think if that scene goes on for a few more moments, I'm thinking they would have had Lee and Longstreet hug, but they kind of cut it at the right time and kind of pull away. And it's the last we see of those two guys.
And once again, a very passive Robert E. Lee.
Right.
Yeah, by all accounts, Lee is not passive on the night of July 3rd.
Right.
He started already to figure out how am I getting this army out of here.
Right.
And so this is not a passive sitting on the cracker box, crying my heart out to James Longstreet. That's just not the reality of this event.
Yeah, agree. And then it does close, as we said earlier, the last scene filmed at the end of September 1992 at sunset was the Chamberlain brothers hugging at the high water mark amid the death and the destruction. Jeff Daniels has got a weird look in his eye, like they're going to make out or something, but they don't. They just hug. It's a brotherly hug kind of thing. The music builds to a crescendo, and we get an Animal House type of what happened to everyone after this movie more or less ends, Eric.
Yeah, I'm just picturing Senator and Mrs. John Plutarski.
Right, exactly. Right. Senator and Mrs. John Harrison, the actor, or something like that, kind of.
Congressman and Mrs. Dan Sickles.
Right. Yeah, that would have been awesome. Probably my biggest grievance, again, is Harrison returns to the stage to play Shakespeare. Probably my biggest grievance there. The credits roll for probably another 20 minutes or so, and you like the soundtrack, again, you get a taste of that.
I'm glad you mentioned the soundtrack. It's actually a pretty good soundtrack.
I like the soundtrack.
That soundtrack holds up well for a lot of Hollywood soundtracks.
Yeah.
I think it adds a lot.
I think it's well
to
done.
That. You want your soundtrack to add to what you're conveying, and I think without that soundtrack and some of the ominous tones and things, I don't know the movie would have the same effect.
And might I say that I think, again, that's a little dated today because subsequent history and war movies made sense then, do not have the big booming soundtrack that you see on Gettysburg. So when you watch Gettysburg today, I think the soundtrack dates it a little bit because of that, but I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I feel like historical movies that have been made in the last 10 or 15 years are all so somber and serious. We need more movies like Gettysburg or Tombstone, where the Wild West was fun. And, you don't get that in your modern movies. And I can't help but wonder if that's why so many of them bomb at the box office.
Yeah, you're dying of tuberculosis, yet you still kill Johnny Ringo.
Exactly.
That's the way it should be.
And you throw off pithy comments while you do that.
Absolutely.
Looking awesome in your duster. All right, so now as we've moved on to Tombstone, we're probably running out of time here on Gettysburg, but the legacy, Eric, what's the legacy of this movie?
I don't think we can discount the legacy of this. Between the movie and I think more specifically The Killer Angels, as we said earlier, Killer Angels is maybe the most influential book ever written on the Battle of Gettysburg.
Yeah, I threw in a gratuitous most important book written of all time. Folks, obviously I don't think of all time, but of Gettysburg, I think there's no doubt that it is.
Yeah, I cannot think of a work of history that has been more influential in the way people think than The Killer Angels.
Give Sickles at Gettysburg another 20 years or so, but for now it's clearly The Killer Angels.
Yeah. We'll revisit this in 20 years.
Exactly, right.
No, we have not committed to a 20th season of the Battle of Gettysburg podcast. I think the legacy is there. It has influenced the way people think about the battle. It influences the way they think about these officers and their performance here. But I think as we made the point, it's maybe faded a little bit into the mist.
It has.
It's
There's
over
no doubt
25 years old now.
Yeah.
But to me, what has happened is it's not so much people are thinking, in the movie Gettysburg, they're saying these tenets of the Killer Angels and the movie. They just don't know where they got it from. It's just gotten out there in the stratosphere so much that's just kind of circulating around. Everybody goes, Longstreet should have gone to the right.
Right.
Well, what popularizes that?
Yeah, I agree.
Jeb Stuart's joyriding. Well, what popularizes that?
Chamberlain and the 20th Maine saved the day.
Absolutely.
Where does that come from?
We see the legacy is there. Whether or not it is as strong as it would have been, say, in 1997, but it's still there. I don't
agree.
think we'll ever be able to discount it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I definitely think it has diminished over the years. And if you think of it, for a long time, TNT used to rerun it all of the time, and they don't anymore. If you were visiting Gettysburg, you could go into the Gettysburg Walmart. Right on that rack greeting you at the store was a Gettysburg DVD. And for various issues associated with the Confederate flag nonsense, that's been pulled from the shelf in places like Walmart or that. So the movie is still out there. It's not as easily accessible as it once was. But as I mentioned earlier, and I'll kind of say this, when I attended the 25th anniversary showing at the Majestic, that was a hell of a good time. And, for the people in the audience, which was full, the theater was full, by the way, it had clearly achieved a Rocky Horror Picture Show kind of cult status where people knew the lines. They laughed at some parts before the part even happened. You knew all the characters and all of that. And, so I think the movie is definitely still with us. But I don't think it has quite the battlefield influence it did. But, like we said, 25, 26 years, you got to expect that.
And we still see it, but I think you're right. It's not to the extent it probably would have been. Of course, I was not guiding in the mid to late 90s, so I think some of our colleagues that were there could probably spoke to that a little bit more. But
maybe we'd hear from some of those guys.
Yeah, I hope we do. Hopefully some of them are listening to us. Or if they are listening to us, they're probably not going to admit they're listening to us.
A lot of the more recent guides, I know, listen to us and have been very supportive.
Absolutely.
I want to thank all of our colleagues who do. But yeah, some of the older guides who, like you say, were around in the mid 90s, I'd be curious if they want to share any recollections about this.
So just like the movie Gettysburg is one of the longest theatrical releases in American history, this has been the longest Battle of Gettysburg podcast maybe we'll ever do. I don't know. Maybe we might go longer, but we've gone pretty long tonight. But I think there's some good content here. I think we did a pretty good deep dive into this event.
And like I always say, if you don't like the episode, it was free. It didn't cost you anything.
Exactly. It's the best deal in Gettysburg. So as we often do, we do have listener questions. We've tried to incorporate some of those into the episode today, but we do have one listener question from Adam, who says, I have two questions. One, I have heard people say the movie helped organizations like the American Battlefield Trust get momentum in preserving the battlefield and returning it to the way it looked in 1863. Do you believe this to be true? And two, if you think that's true or false, if the movie wasn't made, do you think the restoration work would have been done on the battlefield anyway? I thought that was a really good question. It makes us kind of think about also the legacy of this. What's kind of interesting, when this movie is coming out in the early 90s, we do have the modern preservation movement as we know it really starting to begin. A lot of it starts around the 125th anniversary of the war, but by the early 90s, you do see some of these groups taking part in preserving much needed ground. I think it brings attention to Gettysburg. By bringing attention, it causes people to be invested. So it's easier to raise money. It's easier to get attention to certain preservation projects. So I think certainly it influenced it. Now, at this time, the Park Service is already starting to kind of transition into restoring the battlefield back to its 1863 appearance. But I think it does play a role. So to your question, whether or not without the movie would it have happened, it would have happened. I don't know if it would have been to the extent, probably would not have been as well funded as it was, but I do think it plays a role.
Eric, I think you might have mentioned it in the first episode, which now feels like 10 hours ago. You know, the idea that the mid-90s was really the golden era of the Civil War. You know, Glory was still fresh. Gettysburg was still fresh. Ken Burns was still fresh. Civil War Journal. You had all this stuff going on that greatly, for a while, increased the popularity of the Civil War. I personally think all of these things cumulatively worked together to increase and improve preservation. Again, if anybody employed at the Battlefield Trust is, you know, listening to the episode right now, and
Superfan
Gary from
he's going to kill us for this,
from the Washington D.C. area. If anybody, feel free to share your comments on that. But I think cumulatively, the whole thing certainly had a positive impact on preservation. You said it might have happened, maybe it would have, maybe it wouldn't have, but certainly the ability to raise funds and get political support, I think, was greatly increased during the golden era of Civil War studies.
And I think the challenge of any preservation movement is the awareness you make of it. And what better way to create awareness of the American Civil War and the Battle of Gettysburg than this movie that a lot of people have seen. I don't think we can begin to count the number of people that have come to Gettysburg because of the Killer Angels or this movie. I think it's probably not a stretch to say millions. And I think that is an impact that still goes today. It influenced me as a historian.
It influenced me.
It influenced you.
I'm here because of it. And again, I'll just sort of gently remind colleagues, interpreters, business owners in and around the Gettysburg area, the next time you want to criticize the movie, you don't like it or whatever, just remember it did an awful lot for this area and probably your business. I don't personally think there's any doubt about that. We are, I think, hurting a little bit in 2019 because it's been a long time since we had anything comparable to this come along.
Well, I think that about puts a bow on this episode. So I think it's time to bring this thing home as best we can. Otherwise, this episode is going to become a 4.5 hour epic itself.
Could become longer than the movie itself. So again, hopefully you've enjoyed this walk down movie memory lane with Eric and I. Once again, I want to thank our sponsor, RPM Search Group. If your company is on a quest for senior and executive level talent, the kind of talent that will move the needle on corporate performance, then visit their website at www.rpmsearchgroup.com to learn more about RPM Search Group and how they help companies across the United States and around the world identify, evaluate, and hire talent that will improve your profit and performance. We are looking for other sponsors, folks who want to underwrite or sponsor any episodes here on the Battle of Gettysburg podcast. Please contact us if you're interested in sponsoring. Eric, how do people find us on social media?
Right. If you're looking to reach out to us about possibly sponsoring us, you can reach us by email at gettysburgpodcast@gmail.com. You can reach us on Facebook at the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast. You can also find us on Twitter at Gettysburg Pod and on Instagram at the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast. Even if you're not looking to sponsor us and you're just looking to find us, that's where we are. Certainly, please give your feedback and let us know how we're doing. We certainly enjoy talking with our super fans. As we wrap up the episode, I do want to remind everybody that Jim and I are licensed battlefield guides here at Gettysburg. So if you're looking for a tour, a couple ways you can do that. You can contact the Association of Licensed Battlefield Guides at area code 717-337-1709. You can also find guides at the Gettysburg National Military Park Visitor Center or at the Gettysburg Heritage Center. I do want to make note of a special event that the Association of Licensed Battlefield Guides are doing on November 8th and 9th. It is the fall seminar. The topic is Gone But Not Forgotten. We have a really great lineup of tours there. I will be giving a tour on the 1913 reunion here. So if you are around that weekend, please check it out. Some really good events about some more lesser known aspects. So as we finish up episode 9, we turn our attention now to episode 10, which is one that I am very excited about. It is going to focus on one of my favorite generals of the American Civil War, James Johnston Pettigrew. So we are going to talk about Pettigrew's life, his role here in the Gettysburg campaign, and his troops here at Gettysburg.
So you mean I shot that great anecdote about Pettigrew being played by James Bond for nothing? Can I use it again next week? Can I recycle
let's use
it
again. Let's use it again.
So,
absolutely.
Yeah, no, I think we're going to get back to a battle topic a little bit. And the neat thing about Pettigrew and the brigade is that, again, it is one that goes across multiple days. So we don't have to do a first day or a third day episode. We're going to bring Pettigrew's brigade into Gettysburg onto the field, and we will more or less cover them from July 1st all the way through Pickett's charge. And depending on how we're doing on time, maybe even beyond that a little bit.
We've got a lot we can cover. There's a lot here. Some aspects of the battle and campaign that maybe we've not addressed yet.
The most important brigade in all of American history, or am I overstretching it a little bit?
At least to me, they are.
There you go. In your heart. Okay.
Yeah, in my heart. Once again, we want to thank you for listening. One of the best ways that you can help the show is by writing a review for us. Please give us a 5-star review. Let us know how we're doing. That really helps a lot to get the word out. Talked about earlier, if you want to protect this battlefield, you want to preserve the history, creating awareness is part of that. And we hope to be able to do that with the podcast.
Yeah, what he said. I'm hungry and I got to get dinner, so we're going to sign off the episode at this point. Kudos and thank you again to everybody who listens and helps us out, and we look forward to doing this again next time. Eric, you want to go get some Mexican?
You know what? Let's do it. Let's go charge Chapultepec with old George Pickett.
Perfect, with refried beans too.